Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill of shows that we brought your way today. And I was just thinking to myself, the weird thing about doing shows acknowledging the 80th anniversary of various things, because it is the 80th anniversary of 1942, is sometimes more than one thing happens on the same day. So earlier today, we were in Naval, north of Le Havre, for the amazing attack by the British airborne to get the bit of radar. But we are now going 6,398 miles southeast. And yes, I have been on Google to check the distance to the Java Sea to talk about another battle that was happening at the very same time. So my guest today, first time on World War II TV, Geoffrey R. Cox, is an attorney by trade, but also an independent historian, has written several very highly regarded books about the naval campaigns in the Pacific. And the one we are talking about today, I will hold up my copy of it there, Rising Sun, Falling Skies, the disastrous Java Sea campaign of World War II. And as we know, when we've talked about this era before, 42 is the era where things are not necessarily going terribly well for the Allies until kind of a bit later in the year. So this is a bit of bad news comes through the presentation today. But anyway, I will bring in my guest, Geoffrey Cox. So good afternoon, sir. How are you doing today?
Same as always. And you?
I'm very well. So let's leap in with me asking you the question. So how does a guy from Indiana get interested and obsessed about the Pacific naval campaign in World War II?
Well, I got to say, it started when I was a kid, a very young kid, actually, in fourth grade. We had an after-school program where you could take classes on various topics. And one of the topics that I took was World War II. And that fascinated me to no end, the Pacific War especially. And I took to, at that point, gobbling up every book on the Pacific War I could find. Unfortunately, at that point, we did not have Amazon. Al Gore had not invented the internet yet. We didn't have combinedfleet.com or Hyperwar or any of those places. And so my studies were limited to what I could find in my very small local library, and Walden books and B. Dalton books. Anyone remember them? At Washington Square, the mall that was near me at the time. And I gobbled up as many of those things as I could, and I kept reading it and reading everything I could find over the years. We didn't even have Samuel Eliot Morrison's books where I lived for the longest time. So it was just basically teaching myself about the Pacific War. And I found early on that one of the first books I read was Combat Command by Frederick Sherman. It's an account of the Pacific War, the whole Pacific War. He commanded the Lexington at Coral Sea, and then he later commanded the Saratoga Task Force in the Rabaul campaign. And I saw the chapter on the Java Sea campaign, and the first thing I noticed was, to me, it felt noble. I just sensed this: we're against the odds, we're cut off, we're in an alien land, but there is a darkness descending over the Pacific, and we know it, and we have to fight for it. We have to fight against it, I should say. We have friends who are in the way. We don't want to fight, and we couldn't make plans with them on how to deal with this when it came because of that. And so we come in behind the eight ball. We make some serious mistakes at the outset, like the attack on Clark Field that destroyed the Far East Air Force, and then Force Z, which would have been the best ships in any naval task force out there, were sunk. And so it just had the dominoes falling, and we were never able to stop those dominoes from falling. And we stayed out there. We fought as hard as we could. We fought beyond the limits of human endurance, with no time for rest, no time for maintenance of the ships, a reduction in supplies, because it was all three navies were at the end of a very long supply line. And even the Australians from Darwin, it was a long supply line. And then Darwin was destroyed. And we still fought on. And there was something noble about it to me, that we're out here, we're cut off, we're alone, and still we're fighting. The other thing that I found about the Java Sea campaign when I first read about it was there were a lot of unknowns, things that were just generalized about it. Like in the Battle of the Java Sea that I read in Frederick Sherman's book, it didn't mention any of the Japanese ships. And I was thinking, okay, what ships were there? And was there the Chokai? Was there the Atsuka? I knew about the names of Japanese cruisers back when I was in 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. I was a total history nerd, I admit it. And I was like, well, what ships are these? And it took me the longest time just to find out what the ships were in the Battle of the Java Sea. And I'd get conflicting stories about what ships were involved, where they were, what they were doing. You'd have ships just appear out of nowhere, like the Witte Wit, the Dutch destroyer. And like and then the Bankert, it was lost at the end of the war, but no, at the end of the campaign rather. But no one said why. I hadn't even seen it involved in any of the books. And it turns out that Admiral Sherman based his account of the Java Sea campaign on the Office of Naval Intelligence's assessment of it, what they released in 1943. And we didn't know a lot at that time. Obviously, a lot of the Japanese information came in afterwards, after the war. But I didn't have access to all that at the time. And most people didn't. And so it just came little by little over the years until all that information finally came in. And as that information came into me, I noticed that there was really nothing in terms of one book that covered the whole campaign as a campaign. We would have American air sources covering the attack on Clark Field that crippled any air efforts out there. We would have British sources talk about the attack on the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, and the British actions with the Exeter and some destroyers in the Java Sea campaign. We would have Dutch accounts of the De Ruyter, the Java, the Dutch Naval Air Service. We would have some Australian accounts dealing with, say, the Perth or the Yarra and their involvement. But none of it was together. You had to go to all these different sources. And so it seemed to me that I wanted these to be in one place where you could read the account of the campaign straight through as a campaign, not having to go to all these places and then, go to these places afterwards and get a little bit more detail than I could provide, because I could only go into it in the context of the Java Sea campaign. And it seems a bit obvious now why this campaign isn't covered, really, because in the U.S. we talk about Pearl Harbor as the start of the Pacific War.
Yep.
But it wasn't. The war had been going on about 8 hours at that point. A Royal Air Force flying boat, Catalina, piloted by an Australian named Patrick Bedell, it was shot down over the South China Sea because it came too close to the Japanese invasion convoy. And then about 3 hours before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese landed at Kotobaru, and there was a fierce battle there. And they were not able to actually complete their landing at Kotobaru. The British and the Indians did some great resistance there, even though they were outgunned, outnumbered, and basically outshipped and out-aired. And they were fighting. And then there was, the attack on Singapore, the first bombing attack when Singapore's lights were still on. Like, what, are we in a war? And then Pearl Harbor happened. And Pearl Harbor was just meant to keep the United States Pacific Fleet out of it. It was a spectacular success to that extent, at least, but it was never a primary objective. The objective of the Japanese was the islands around the Java Sea, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and the Malay Peninsula and Singapore, for the resources they provide, especially oil, but not just oil. You had rubber, you got tin. It was the original war for oil.
Yeah, I'm not going to jump in here, and that's been a fantastic introduction there. But you're basically preaching to the choir here, because one of the things we bang on about on World War II TV is over the years the national telling of their history. So British talk about the British role in World War II, Americans talk about the American, the Australians, and it's bringing it all together in context and realizing that lots of events are happening at the same time. And so what I try and do is remind people, as you say, that while Pearl Harbor's happening, there's also stuff happening in Singapore, and it's one big global campaign, and it's important to think about it as such. So, well, you've come armed with a magnificent set of images, so we're going to hand over to you to kind of take us through this. Folks, if you have questions, jump in and fire away. We'll kind of do the little ones as we go along, and the big ones towards the end. But I'm sure I'm speaking for lots of people watching today that we're not particularly knowledgeable about the Java Sea campaign, but we will be at the end of this. So over to you, Jeffrey, and we'll just kind of crack on through.
Well, thank you very much. Let's go to the next slide, because I want to touch on that lack of knowledge about the Java Sea campaign, especially here in the United States. We talk about Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a tremendous success for the Japanese, not the complete success that they wanted, but a tremendous success. It immobilized the Pacific Fleet, humiliated us. We could not respond. And then Douglas MacArthur's Far East Air Force was destroyed on the ground around Clark Field. And then more on that in a little bit. And then, as far as we talk about it, there's the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, where we stopped the Japanese and we finally turned them back. Okay, well, what happened before that? The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Okay, well, what happened right after Pearl Harbor? Well, we stopped them at Coral Sea and we gave them a bloody nose at Midway, America. Yeah. What happened between phase one and phase the Battle of the Coral Sea? And that's where the Java Sea campaign comes in. It's not in the American consciousness, certainly. There are people who try to get that out there for more and more people to understand, and more books are coming out dealing with it, and that's a good thing in my mind, even though they're competitors, because I want the Java Sea campaign to be well known. And if you look at this slide, this is the reason it's not well known. Look at some of those titles: The Lonely Ships, Fortnight of Infamy, The Fleet the Gods Forgot, Bloody Shambles, The Ghost That Died in Sunda Strait, MacArthur's Pearl Harbor, Every Day a Nightmare, and The Lonely Ships, and my personal favorite, Japanese Destroyer Captain. And these are not happy titles. These are not titles that speak of victory, except Japanese Destroyer Captain. This was a bad campaign. This ended in defeat, and it was not close. And those things are kind of painful to look at, where we realize some of the things that we needed to do better. Perhaps we still need to do better. And it's also an uncomfortable question about being prepared for war. How do you want to prepare for war? You can't be mobilized all the time. But in this case of the Pacific War, we had aircraft out there that had practice ammunition only. The USS Houston, her 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, 75% of the shells would not work. And this was on. And the torpedoes, the story about the torpedoes. Even though most of the torpedoes that we had for the older submarines at Cavite Navy Yard, they were an older model that actually did function. And on and on and on. We were completely unprepared for this. And we didn't even have the mindset that war is coming. The one who was the most prepared for war in the Far East was Admiral Hart, the head of the Asiatic Fleet, and he had the smallest fleet with no air cover. So let's go to the next slide a little bit, if we could. Yeah, the hours after Pearl Harbor, we had a pre-war plan for dealing with the Japanese. It went by various names. It started out as War Plan Orange, but we would call it Rainbow 5. And what it called for was, if there's an attack on the U.S., the Far East Air Force goes up and it attacks the Japanese airfields on Formosa. Now, Douglas MacArthur, he was heavily invested in the idea that the Japanese were not going to attack until spring of 1942. And I'm not totally sure on what he based that, because the Japanese at this point, they were getting very kind of desperate in China. They had been fighting a war in China. The whole Pacific War was started because the Japanese invaded China and they could not bring that war to a successful conclusion. It was costing them money, a lot of money. They had captured every port, every industrial area, most of the arable land. But the Chinese, they just retreated to Chongqing up the Yangtze River, and the Japanese could not make them surrender. And so they were in a quagmire. And they had the choice, keep fighting this and keep losing all these resources, all this money, or let's start a Pacific War to get those resources with a bigger power. Now we're going to lose that war. The Japanese knew they would probably lose that war and lose it catastrophically. At least the Japanese leadership did. But that was considered preferable to losing face by withdrawing from China, or being compelled to withdraw from China by supplies such as oil, rubber, and tin being cut off because the Japanese had angered everyone with their treatment of the Chinese and had made several offensive actions, such as moving into Saigon's air complex, which had no justification for the Chinese war. It was completely in preparation to attack the British and the Dutch and the Americans. And so we had this plan, Rainbow 5, which the Far East Air Force under Douglas MacArthur and its B-17s were supposed to go up to Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and attack the Japanese airfields there. But for various reasons and various accounts explaining it, Douglas MacArthur disappeared the morning of December 8th, 1941. That was December 7th. In the Far East was actually December 8th. So Douglas MacArthur disappeared for several critical hours in the morning. And there are various stories about what he was doing during that time, but they're not consistent. His own story isn't consistent. And the best guess that I have is that he was so shaken that he was wrong, that he had a sort of a mild nervous breakdown, and he spent the morning in his bedroom trying to get himself into mental shape for it. He spent a lot of it reading the Bible, apparently, while his chief of staff was trying to keep people out until Douglas MacArthur could get himself together. And that's, I have to say, some people find that an offensive explanation. I find it to be a charitable explanation because it gives him a medical out for what happened and a justification for not court-martialing him for violating Rainbow 5.
And he's a human being, Jeff. I mean, this is a massive, great shock, and he's in a position of responsibility, and this is a massive, great thing that's happened. So yeah, I think it just humanizes him, frankly.
Yeah, and he put himself out there too, saying that the Japanese were going to attack until spring of 1942, and then he would be ready and then bring it on. Well, they attacked before that, and he wasn't ready. He didn't have nearly the fighter power, the air power. His army was not fully trained yet, and so he was in trouble, and he knew it. And it was a shock to him. And it's in having a panic attack, a nervous breakdown. That's involuntary. That's medical. That's chemical in your brain. So what happened was he did not launch the attack. The Japanese, they were fogged in on Formosa, and we tried to prepare for an air attack from the Japanese. And the call came from Washington to MacArthur specifically, said, our planes were caught on the ground at Pearl Harbor. Don't let your plane get caught on the ground over there. And MacArthur said, yeah, we got our tails in the air. And we did get a lot of our fighters in the air, and we got the B-17s in the air so that they would not be caught on the airfield. But the fighters were mispositioned. The commander of the fighters, the fighter director, basically, he positioned them to defend Manila and not the airfields on the way to Manila. If he had positioned them more forward, he might have had more success. But he positioned them very badly. And the B-17s and some of the fighters, they had to land to refuel. And while they were landing to refuel, the Japanese showed up. There was a lot of bad luck and a lot of bad fighter direction here. But if you go to the next slide, this was the result. And it was very high altitude bombing. They had the Mitsubishi G3M bombers and the Nels and the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, which the Bettys would be a major pain to us in the early moments of the war. They bombed Clark Field from high altitude, destroyed most of its facilities. And then they had the Zeros, the Japanese Zero fighters, sweep down and machine gun and hit with 20 millimeter cannons anything that was still standing. So pretty much all the aircraft, all the B-17s, all the fighters, which were the most advanced fighters we had at that point at Clark Field, were destroyed, and the Clark Field complex. We also attacked like Nichols Field and Iba, and the Japanese took out the early warning radar that was positioned there. So now we wouldn't know when the Japanese were about to launch an air attack or not. And this was the first domino of one particular branch, because we were never able to recover at that point enough to even seriously contest control of the air, let alone gain control of it. It was always the Japanese controlled the air. There's nothing we can do about it. And that set that domino going for the down the Java Sea campaign, because the Japanese had gained so much by the eradication of the Air Force at Clark Field that, and they gained it with almost no losses. You would expect to inflict, some losses on the Japanese at that point. So they couldn't push as hard as they wanted to, because they lost, maybe a half dozen zeros or something. But they lost almost nothing. This was a very, very cheap conquest here, a very, very cheap success. They destroyed half of MacArthur's Air Force, and the rest of it, with the Japanese had hundreds of planes, and MacArthur did not. And it came to be that we eventually ended up hiding the planes we had left. And the Navy had to send up its PBY Catalina flying boats, which were for reconnaissance, not combat. And the story of the Catalina could be told that the legend is that the pilot radioed, "Enemy fighters sighted. Please notify next of kin." And that's pretty much what happened when you put the Catalinas out there, who they could not deal with combat. You should have been sending B-17s out there, but we hardly any B-17s left. So at that point, that was the first domino in one branch. And the second domino would fall about 3 days later, or 2 days later, December 10th. We're talking about what's called the destruction of Force Z. And there's a huge backstory behind this. And I didn't realize it for a long time, but this is sort of a cottage industry in Britain, as I understand it, discussing the destruction of these two ships in this task force, and why it happened, and why the British had a Navy base at Singapore in the first place, when they couldn't really put a fleet there, not yet. And then they try to send ships out there to try to deter the Japanese, but instead it attracts them. They wanted to send a carrier there, the carrier Indomitable, I believe. And then the captain decided to go into a Caribbean island, and harbor pilots are for sissies. And then he runs the ship aground. So no British carrier for the Far East Fleet at that point. And the carrier didn't have a captain anymore after that point. They had to find a new one. Can't imagine why. And there were heated discussions between Churchill and his admirals about what to do about the Japanese, because they knew the Japanese had their eyes on Singapore and the Malay states. And the idea, I think, was deterrence. They didn't want the Japanese to attack at all. Yeah. But there was a difference of opinion as to how to achieve that. And a lot of those discussions have been lost. And I don't think that's a coincidence. But it seems the Admiralty wanted to send a larger fleet of slower battleships there to Singapore, while Winston Churchill, in one of his very few misjudgments at all, but this one was catastrophic, he said, well, let's just send these two battleship type deals over there, and they'll go and they'll hide among all the islands of Indonesia, and the Japanese will worry about that. And he seems to have forgotten about this whole air power thing, and that it's a little hard for a battleship to hide. But anyway, so they sent the battleship Prince of Wales under Admiral Tom Phillips, and the battle cruiser Repulse. The Prince of Wales to Singapore. The Prince of Wales was seen as something of an unlucky ship, because she had not had a chance to work up before she was kicked out of dry dock to go and face the battleship Bismarck. And then she took an unlucky hit there that knocked out her electrical system. And there seemed to have been some blame on the Prince of Wales, unfair, I would say, for the sinking battle cruiser Hood at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. But the Prince of Wales had recovered from that. And so they went around the Horn of Africa and all the way to the Singapore Navy base that the British had built at tremendous expense. But they didn't defend the landward sides. They thought the jungle there was impenetrable, which anything that's impenetrable is only impenetrable until it isn't.
Yeah. And just to jump in here, Jeff, all you need to do, folks, is go back and watch the 2-hour Singapore show we did a couple of weeks ago. And Ross Cable and Brian Farrell explain a lot of this whole Malayan and Singapore campaign. And you're absolutely right, Jeff. The discussion of the Singapore plan and the sending down of the fleet is something that us British talk about a lot, just like Americans talk about the last stand of Custer. And we talk about as Brits about the Battle of Arnhem. Singapore is something we haven't quite got over yet, and we like talking about it. And there are no firm conclusions. Everyone's got their own opinions about it. But yeah, it is. The ultimate thing is the fall of Singapore is the biggest defeat the British have ever suffered in our maritime and land history. So it's a big subject
and a fair fight. In a fair fight, I mean, the British had enough troops to defend Singapore, and they had enough supplies to defend it. It was just Arthur Percival was an idiot, it seems. But the way this started, in terms of the war, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were at the Singapore Navy base when the attack on Pearl Harbor took place, when the Japanese invaded Kotabaru. And the word got back to London that, we're going to have a war. We got a war in the Pacific now. What do we do? London could not figure out what to do. They gave them no instruction. And so Admiral Tom Phillips had a rather nocturnal conversation at the Singapore Navy base with some of the civilian government officials and some of the senior admirals. And he said, well, let's see. The Japanese are doing a seaborne invasion, and we got a battleship and a battle cruiser. I think we should use the battleship and the battle cruiser to try to stop the invasion. Now, is it just me, or is that kind of obvious? And to me, it seems obvious. In the absence of any other instructions, he got nothing from London. He was on his own, and he made the decision to go to where the shooting was, or at least where he thought the shooting was. And he tried to arrange for air cover. He tried to arrange for destroyers. As it turned out, he could only have 4 destroyers escorting the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. It was a very unbalanced force. He couldn't arrange for consistent air cover. And I hit over the head my readers with the idea that the 2 most important elements of any military operation are information and communications. Almost every battle, not all of them, but almost every battle, any defeat or victory can be traced to those 2 factors, and they're interrelated. You can't really separate them. Now, we can talk about logistics, we can talk about number of troops, number of ships, number of planes, but information and communication are the 2 biggest things. Both of them broke down here. Admiral Phillips left his chief of staff ashore to keep him filled in on what was going on in the air campaign because they had radio silence. So there was the head of the British Far Eastern Fleet was basically incommunicado. He probably should have been ashore, but it's not clear as to whether he could have stayed ashore because he was expected to command this force. And so he takes the force out to look for this Japanese invasion force. And the Japanese are ready for it, or at least they say they are. And they had moved ahead with positioning some air assets at that newly acquired Saigon Air Base. And one of them, multiple of them, used the Mitsubishi G4M Navy Type 1 land attack plane, the Betty, that we call it later on. We gave bombers female names and fighters male names. But if you look at the name of this plane, the Mitsubishi G4M Navy Type 1 land attack plane, it's pretty self-explanatory as to why we came up with this code naming system, calling it a Betty instead of running off with, the Mitsubishi G4M Navy Type 1 land attack plane. It doesn't roll off the tongue, really. It's not really marketable in terms of what you would say today. So the Japanese put those assets in Saigon, and the British were aware of those bombers in Saigon, and they were aware that those bombers could carry torpedoes. And the report that they could carry torpedoes, there were 2 sets of them. One of them was buried on a desk in Singapore. The other one was buried on a desk at the Admiralty. Nobody told Admiral Phillips. Whether he would have gone out knowing that these aircraft were out there and they could carry torpedoes and aim them at his battleships, no one knows. But he was never told about the torpedoes being there. And the British knew about it. One of them, it was intentionally withheld, and I don't know why. But the second one at the Far East Combined Bureau in Singapore, it was just buried somewhere. And they tried to track down the people who buried it afterwards, and it was never really solved. It's another one of those mysteries. So the Prince of Wales and the Repulse are out there looking for the Japanese. The Japanese are pulling their invasion forces back a little bit to try to deal with the battleship. They send out elements of the 11th Air Fleet. It's later called an operational name Base Air Force, because it's an Air Force that flies from a base. So let's call it Base Air Force. Not really the most creative, but they go out on a nocturnal attempt to try to find the Prince of Wales and Repulse and bomb them and torpedo them, more importantly. Except they find a ship. The scout finds a ship. He drops a flare over it to mark it for the attack. And it turns out that ship is the Japanese flagship. And so you have these frantic messages. No, don't attack us. We're the Japanese. And the scout pilot's like, you're lying. You're not the Japanese. And so Ozawa ordered all the fighters, all the bombers back at that point. Anything can happen in a night attack. Anything can happen. So the next day, December 10th, they've been poking around. They can't find the Japanese. And so they decide to turn back. And while they're turning back, they get a report of the Japanese possibly landing on the coast of Malaysia. And so they turn to that point to see maybe they can finally inflict some damage on the Japanese. There's nothing there. It's some beautiful rainforest with water buffaloes and all kinds of fun stuff there. And Philip spends a lot of time looking at this area, and it seems nonsensical, except he wanted a fight. He wanted to face the Japanese. He knew what the Japanese were doing to the British up in northern Malaysia. The British were losing, and he knew it, and he wanted to stop them. And it seems like he was frustrated at this point. And he had told his chief of staff, Admiral Palliser, try to arrange for fighter cover, because he didn't want to be air attack. And so Palliser was trying to make sure that they could get air cover. Now, the initial objective of Force Z when they left was Singora. There was a Japanese force that was in that area, and they were targeting them. And Admiral Palliser was not able to arrange for the fighter cover off of Singora because they didn't have enough air bases left. And so he sent a message to that effect. Fighter protection on Wednesday, the 10th, will not be possible. That was the message he sent. He didn't have off Singora. He left those 2 words off. Now remember that, because it has an effect, and an unfortunate effect. And that, again, information, communications. The Japanese, in somewhat of a bit of luck, because they were running out of fuel at that point, they find the Prince of Wales and the repulse. And if we can go to the next slide, the first attack is a bombing attack. They hit the repulse with a bomb. Doesn't really do a whole lot. The Admiral Phillips, he was controlling the evasive maneuvers, and that was messing up all the anti-aircraft firing solutions. So they said, yeah, let us kind of do it on our own at this point. So let's go to the next slide. And this is an interesting slide. This is an interesting photo because it has obviously been doctored. This is a Japanese photo from one of their attacking planes. I think what happened is they had two photos that covered a wider area of the horizon, the wider area of the battlefield. Like probably the destroyer in front was further to the right somewhere, but the Japanese wanted to release one photo. They wanted to capture one photo.
1941 Photoshop, essentially.
Yeah, and the Japanese do this a lot, actually. And so they move that destroyer into this photo. The wake behind it, you see like two wakes there and one next to it. The destroyer is probably further to the right, but it was there, and the ships in the background are the Prince of Wales and the repulse, as far as we can tell. And we go to the next slide. And this is just explaining a concept to people. It's called combing the wakes or combing the torpedoes. The Japanese were coming in with these blazing fast aircraft, and blazing in terms of the Mitsubishi G4M has a double meaning there, because usually if you hit it with one bullet, it would explode or set fire, but not today. It was fast. The British were not ready for a plane that fast. The British were not ready for torpedoes. Someone came up to Admiral Phillips and said, sir, I do believe the Japanese are carrying torpedoes. And Admiral Phillips comes back with, no, they're not. There are no torpedo craft about. But one of the destroyers signals, sir, the Japanese aircraft are carrying torpedoes. Oh, bugger. And Phillips was probably shocked at that point, because had those reports sitting on the desks, nobody had told them they could carry torpedoes. Torpedoes are really scary for ships, much more scary than bombs. Bombs can damage a ship, but they have to cause secondary damage in order to sink it. Torpedoes can sink a ship outright. You put a hole in a ship's hull, it's got to go to their shipyard. So these were very dangerous torpedo planes coming in, and the typical way to stop them or to avoid the torpedoes is what's called combing the torpedoes or combing the wakes. You want to present as small a target as possible. Now, if you look at the top, you got those 4 torpedoes going in to the Prince of Wales, and Prince of Wales is showing off her beam. Let's call her beam, her side. That's the biggest possible target. What the Prince of Wales tried to do was turn into the torpedoes. You could turn into them or you could turn away from them. Usually they want to turn away, but that's not always possible. So instead you present a narrow stern or bow profile. It's much more difficult for a torpedo that's already launched to hit a target that is presenting such a small profile. So let's go to the next slide, please. And this is where the luck of the Prince of Wales reared its ugly head, because the Prince of Wales was turning to avoid torpedoes. She avoided all of them except for one. And that one torpedo went to near the stern area and detonated. And this was about as catastrophic a torpedo hit as you could have without it being immediately fatal. What happened was it threw off the propeller shaft. It was out of alignment. Now, propeller shaft is sort of like the straw I have here for my Diet Coke. If you windmill it around, you make the hole in this lid larger. And that's exactly what happened with the Prince of Wales. The propeller shaft went through several bulkheads with glands meant to secure it against the water coming in from the outside. But because it was off center, it shredded all the glands. And because this was the propeller shaft passage, you couldn't shut those bulkheads off. So you had water going into the engine room, which is one of the biggest areas of the ship. And it knocked out electrical power. It knocked out that propeller. At some point, that propeller fell off. The damage had already been done at that point. Much of the electrical system was knocked off. And communications. Again, communications and information. Communications aboard the ship were knocked out. So Admiral Phillips and the captain, Captain Leach, were probably never aware of just how bad the ship was damaged. There were things they could have done about it in terms of damage control, but they didn't know because the communications couldn't get there. And this is part of the problem with the Prince of Wales being such a new ship. She was a new class of ships even. She had not had time to adequately train the crew in the ships. If you train long enough, you can find your way around the ship in the dark. You can find your way around the ship blindfolded. It becomes second nature to you. That's why they train over and over and over again. This has to become second nature. That's to become instinct. The Prince of Wales did not have time to do that before she went out for the Bismarck. And then she gets repairs and is sent out again. It was hoped that she could work up. That's what the term is, work up, before she got out to Singapore. But this was a completely new ship. They didn't have a cadre of people who were familiar with the layout of the ship. And you ended up with damage control parties just standing there with nothing to do, even though there were things they could have done to connect the electrical system back up. And this was just an absolutely catastrophic hit. And the Prince of Wales was sort of stuck at that point, of not sure what to do, not sure what the damage was. Communications was out. Let's go to the next slide. And that's showing where the flooding was on the ship ultimately. And the green parts are where the counter flooding was to try to keep the ship on an even keel. Let's go to the next one. And the Prince of Wales just kept getting beat up by torpedoes. This is from Kevin Denley's report. He dove the wrecks of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in the South China Sea. And he reports, unfortunately, that those wrecks are being dismantled piece by piece by grave robbers. And a lot of the wrecks are being dismantled. Some of them are even gone at this point. But he reported that the propellers of both both ships were gone at this point. The torpedo hits and some of the bomb hits, they just destroyed the Prince of Wales' ability to steer or even turn, or in some cases move. The ship's upside down in this diagram here. So the port side is is at the top.
Right.
You see the torpedo hit there, the explosion there, and it just completely broke that propeller shaft. Then there was another hit on the starboard side, and it bent one of the propeller shafts into the other one. And so the Prince of Wales was being compromised real quick. Her rudder was jammed, and she would have to steer by engine, but she couldn't do that because she basically had only one propeller left functioning. And so she could only just turn slightly and keep going. And still no electrical system. She needed that for her anti-aircraft guns. She was listings, and she couldn't depress her anti-aircraft guns soon enough or down enough to meet torpedo planes. And so she was in big trouble at this point, and she had no communications. And at some point, it was Captain Tennant of the Repulse, who was a beloved figure. And the Repulse was a very well-run ship. She was old, but she was well-run. And he found out that Admiral Phillips had not sent a message to Singapore requesting help. And so he sent the message himself, requesting air cover. Eventually, Phillips came out and he sent a message for tugs. He wanted tugs. He wanted destroyers. He didn't ask for air cover. Why didn't he ask for air cover? Why didn't he think it urgent to tell Singapore what was going on? Because he thought air cover was not available because of that message from Admiral Palliser that told him air cover was not available. He meant air cover off Singora. He didn't mean air cover at all. There was a fighter squadron sitting at Singapore waiting for the call from Admiral Phillips to come in. And the call never came until it was way too late. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is what is called the hammer and anvil attack. And this is a sort of a simplified demonstration or diagram of it. The Japanese focused on the repulse with one of their next torpedo attacks, and they did what was called an anvil attack. Remember what I said earlier about combing the torpedoes, combing the wakes? The way around that is you give them no place to turn. So you look at this attack here. What is the repulse supposed to do? She could turn into the torpedoes to the left, turn into the torpedoes to the right, but she exposes herself to the torpedoes that are coming in from the upper right. The ideal anvil attack is one that comes in off of both the starboard and the port bow. She's got the attack coming in here off the starboard bow, and this is the attack that was fatal for her. She was a ballerina in this battle, and I know ballet. I've taken ballet lessons. It is tough to be a ballerina, but she brought her point shoes to this dance, and she avoided as many as she could. But there were just too many torpedoes, and the anvil attack was too effective. And so she ended up being gutted out. Let's go to the next slide. And she went down, and then it was the Prince of Wales' turn, and she took several more torpedo hits. She started listing badly. The destroyer Express starts coming over, and the admiral sends a message. What are you coming alongside for? And I could just imagine the captain of the Express thinking, seriously? You're sinking. You're sinking. Do you know you're sinking? But he didn't say that. He was a good subordinate, and he pulled alongside. And this shows just what was happening as the Prince of Wales was being abandoned. Admiral Phillips was muttering he could not recover from this, and Captain Leach stayed with him on the bridge. This shot shows, and it's a confusing shot, but it's up from the starboard side. The Express, the destroyer, is in the foreground. Why did the British have a destroyer called Express and not one called Local? It's just one of those questions that I have. Anyway, in the background, you can see two 5-inch mounts, twin mounts. Those were high-angle anti-aircraft guns that were state-of-the-art, and it was believed that they could stop any attack. But they could not depress enough. You see the ship is listing. They could not depress enough to catch the Japanese aircraft as they attacked at that point. And without electrical power, they couldn't even be turned. The British used chains. They used everything they could. But the ship was abandoned very calmly. It was not, there was no panic. And the Express had some trouble trying to avoid the bilge keel, the Prince of Wales, but she didn't entirely. And so she was damaged and ended up missing part of the campaign for that reason. And the Prince of Wales sank. And just as she was sinking, British fighters, Royal Air Force fighters from Singapore at Sembo Wing, I believe, they arrived overhead. And the sailors who were in the water at that point, they were shaking their fists at them. They were screaming curses at them. But the pilots, they were ready to go. They had wanted to be there for the Prince of Wales and the repulse, and nobody told them. Now, they had some outmoded fighters they were fighting, the Brewster Buffalo, which was really sort of aviation terrorism at that point. It was a terrible fighter, and it was designed, it was made to be just a very flawed fighter, but they didn't need to do air combat with Zeros. There were no Japanese fighters here. They just needed to disrupt the torpedo attacks. Yeah. You don't need to shoot down the bed. You just need to make her think about something else. And but they came too late. It was a major controversy again, and they were made to look bad, and it was not their fault. I put the blame there on Admiral Palliser because he sent a very bad message, and it was understandable, but it was misinterpreted. At least I believe it was misinterpreted.
Super.
And it still goes on to this day, the debate as to what happened with Force Z. This was a noble effort, but while Admiral Palliser and his ships were being sunk, the British in London were sleeping because they had tabled a discussion as to what to do with the Repulse and the Prince of Wales the night before. And to me, that's just unthinkable. These ships are risking their lives, risking the lives of their men, and you can't decide what to do with them. They could have stayed in Singapore. They could have went out. Admiral Phillips did. There was talk of withdrawing them to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. But they thought, yeah, let's just sleep on it. Yeah, what could go wrong? Well, then Churchill woke up the next morning and he took the call that said the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk, and he was shocked. And you should have done your part, Prime Minister Churchill. And he's a great man. He was a great man, a great wartime leader, a great leader overall, and he was funny. He had a very sharp wit, and he was highly intelligent, but when he was wrong, he was catastrophically wrong. Between this and Gallipoli, as I recall it. Let's go to the next slide. Cavite Navy Yard. This was the same day the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk, and both of those ships would have been the centerpiece of any striking force of Allied ships that could have been put together in the Java Sea campaign. Cavite Navy Yard was the headquarters of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, which is now known as the 7th Fleet. And with no aircraft left because of the Clark Field disaster, there was no one to protect Cavite Navy Yard. And it was a very cramped facility. There were a lot of the village of Cavite, actually the neighborhood of Cavite, a lot of wooden shacks with corrugated metal roofs. The base was okay. It had stockpiles and everything. But if you think Pearl Harbor was bad, go to the next shot. Pearl Harbor ain't got nothing on Cavite Navy Yard. The Japanese showed up and they calmly went over picking their targets, knowing there were no fighters to bother them, and knowing that the anti-aircraft guns of Cavite Navy Yard could not reach them. The Japanese were too high. They bombed from high altitude. And they were just devastating. At an early part of the attack, they hit the power plant. The power plant was needed to power the pumps for firefighting. With the power plant out, there was almost no way to fight the fires that resulted from the bombing. They hit a cache of torpedoes. They hit the submarine Sea Lion with a bomb, and she burned so fiercely that she blistered the paint on the submarine next to her, the Sea Dragon, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. But the base was literally, go to the next slide. The base was literally turned to slag. This was that bad. You can see the power plant in the background, and you can see the conning tower of the Sea Lion. At that point, she was just unsalvageable, and so they had to leave her behind. I think her engine wasn't even in her at that point. But this was the headquarters of the Asiatic Fleet. This was their main base, and it was just completely destroyed. And when I say it was turned to molten slag, that's not an exaggeration. The fires burned so hot that they melted much of the metal together. And this was the largest destruction of U.S. property since the War of 1812.
And just to jump in for a second, I can completely understand now your analogy of it being a domino effect. I mean, if people are wondering why haven't we got to the Java Sea yet, this is all absolutely vital to build these stepping stones so that when we get to the Java Sea, it all makes sense.
Yes, it is. And the Prince of Wales and the Repulse sinking, that was another one of the dominoes. They would have been the dominant ships in any Allied task force. The Japanese would have had to commit battleships of their own. And, well, they didn't have to. Not really. So let's go to the next slide. Patrol Wing 10. I had mentioned them earlier. The only Navy air power in the Far East at that point was Patrol Wing 10. They were dependent on the Far East Air Force under Douglas MacArthur for fighter protection, for bombers, and with the Far East Air Force largely destroyed, well, now they're in trouble. And Patrol Wing 10 started being a main target of the Japanese, trying to get rid of them. In fact, one of the first combat actions in the Java Sea campaign was in the Gulf of Davao, when the seaplane tender William B. Preston was attacked by planes from the Japanese light carrier Ryujo. Again, that was very, very early, and she managed to get away, though some of the Catalinas were hit on the water. These two photos. On the left is the USS Langley. She had been the first aircraft carrier, and she had been converted from a collier, and it was a very interesting collier because it was a class of 4 ships. Of those 4 ships, 3 of them disappeared without explanation. The most famous of them was I'm spacing it on this one. The Cyclops. There it is. The Cyclops. The Cyclops disappeared in 1918 among questions about whether her captain was really supporting the Imperial German war effort in World War I and possibility of a mutiny among a very angry crew. And the Navy to this day does not know what happened to the Cyclops. 2 other ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, they were turned over to the British, and they disappeared off of the U.S. East Coast in 1940 and 41, I believe. 40, within a month of each other. The Langley was converted from the Jupiter, and she was the first aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy. She was mostly experimental. And when you had the Lexington and the Saratoga converted from battlecruiser hulls, you had the Ranger made from the keel up, and then you had the Enterprise, the Hornet, the Yorktown, the Wasp. Yeah, I find it interesting that we like to name our capital ships after insects. The Langley was too slow and too small to deal with the top aircraft anymore, and so they decided to convert her to a seaplane tender, which involved taking off about a third of her flight deck. I guess, I'm not sure why they did it that way. She was a very good seaplane tender. She had all kinds of supplies, but she was very, very slow, and that would turn out to be a problem in the end. On the right is a consolidated PBY Catalina. Those were the aircraft that were flown by Patrol Wing 10 and flown very heroically. This was a PBY-5. What the Patrol Wing 10 largely flew were PBY-4s. The big difference was that bubble window that you see was actually a hatch. So it wasn't quite as cool looking as this PBY-5. I took this at the San Diego Air and Space Museum in Balboa Park, which is an excellent museum. I highly recommend it. Let's go to the next slide, please. And these were the big figures of the Navy actions of the combined Allied command that was known as ABDACOM, the American, British, Dutch, and Australian command. And I would imagine that there were some fights over the order of the letters there because this thing seemed racked from the start. It was placed under the command, and this was in January of 42, the command of General Sir Archibald Wavell. I think that's how his name is pronounced, Wavell. And he had been a general in North Africa and fought Rommel there. And he was respectable. He did as decent a job as you could do against Rommel. But this was a very fractious command with competing priorities, competing doctrines, competing ideologies, even competing languages. This was the naval portion was called ABDA-Float, and soon enough, the float part of it would be considered optional. You had people from 4 different countries, 3 different navies who spoke 2 different languages. And that was never resolved. Again, communications. Communications was a big problem with ABDACOM and ABDA-Float. And they were fighting right from the outset. Admiral Hart had been picked to head ABDA-Float. And so he went to meet the Dutch Governor General. It was so bad in the Philippines that Hart he couldn't fly down to Surabaya to escape the Philippines. The U.S. Navy's, the Asiatic Fleet was withdrawing to Dutch Indonesia. And, nobody had really asked the Dutch at that point, but the Dutch didn't have much of a navy to defend Indonesia. And so it was figured they wouldn't turn away. But Hart showed up and he was told that, hey, it's ABDACOM, you're going to head the Navy. Why don't you go meet with the Dutch Governor General? So he went there and he was set up, and Hart's on the right. Admiral Hart is in this photo, he's on the right. In the middle is Admiral Conrad Helfrich, who was commanding the Dutch forces, naval forces in the East Indies. The Dutch East Indies Squadron is what it was called. He was very resentful of not being given the command of ABDA-Float. And that was part of, the command arrangement. It's American, British, Dutch, Australian command. So you had a British guy heading the Royal Air Force, heading the Air Force, ABDA Air. Well, there wasn't really much of it. A Dutch heading the land forces, Admiral or General Hein ter Poorten, and the naval forces were headed by American Admiral Hart. But Conrad Helfrich didn't like that. In the Dutch establishment in the East Indies, Helfrich was actually above Hein ter Poorten, who was considered a colonial officer. Helfrich was actually a native of the Dutch East Indies. He was born in Semarang. And he did not take this too well. He set up Admiral Hart several times. He would actually be something of a hindrance in the campaign. He was an expert hydrographer, but he was a bully. And he was conniving. And it ended up hurting the Allied cause in multiple instances. Let's go to the next slide. And ABDACOM was basically over this entire area. Now you see the Netherlands East Indies. The Dutch wanted to defend the Netherlands East Indies. They didn't really have the Navy for it. For one thing, they had been occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940, so they had no supplies coming in from the mother country. But the worst problem is they had been overcome by pacifism in the years since their last naval campaign, and they had put very, very little into developing a navy, even though they had to defend the Netherlands East Indies. They felt like, okay, if we don't bother anyone, no one will bother us. That's not the way it works in the world, as Ukraine is finding out right now. And you have to be prepared for people to bother you. Otherwise, you're going to be seen as a target. You're going to be seen as bait. And that's what happened here. The Dutch were completely unprepared for the German invasion in 1940, and they were completely unprepared for the Japanese. And they knew it. At a late hour, the Dutch Queen offered to buy 2 British battleships with hard cash. She was going to give the British the hard cash for some battleships immediately. And the British were like, hey, we need this for ourselves. You know, you're on your own for it. You made your bed here. We'll give you what we can, but we got to defend against Germany too. So the Dutch East Indies Squadron, it actually had an advanced naval air service with some pretty creative innovations there. But in terms of surface forces, it was pitiful. The flagship was a Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter, and the fact that it was a light cruiser was sort of a problem. She had 7 6-inch guns, 4 of which faced behind her, which made no sense. She didn't carry torpedo tubes. She had some very good anti-aircraft guns, but unfortunately they couldn't fire forward because they were positioned in such a way that if you fired them forward, you would hit the bridge, which is considered a bad thing when you hit your own bridge. It's a little bit embarrassing at the very least. They had the Java, which was an old cruiser who didn't even have turrets. She had single gun mounts, 10 of them, and also did not carry torpedoes. I don't understand why people didn't like torpedoes at this point. The Japanese loved them, and they used them to great effect. The Dutch, at this point, they did not have enough people to man all the ships in the East Indies Squadron. At least 2 ships sat idle, and one of them was the destroyer Biti Bith. The other one was the sister ship of the Java, the Sumatra. And the Dutch tried to crew them. They didn't have enough people. And they tried to get some Royal Navy sailors who had been on the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to go crew these ships, but with Dutch officers. And the British were like, no, we'll take our own officers. Thank you very much. And so you see the problem here where the Dutch understandably want to defend the Netherlands East Indies now, but they didn't prepare for it. They were convinced with their moral high horse of pacifism, and it was coming back to bite them in the butt. The Australians wanted to defend Australia. Understandable. And they didn't really have the industrial base, but they're tough fighters. Anyone who dealt with the Australian military will tell you they are tough fighters. The British wanted to defend Singapore, and that's understandable as well. It was considered a fortress. It was their big Navy base, although the Navy for that base was not quite as big now as it used to be. And they wanted to defend the Malay Peninsula. The Americans, they wanted to get back to the Philippines. They've been forced out of the Philippines, and they wanted to get back there somehow. So you see, this is pulling in 4 different directions here. And it wasn't just that. The Dutch had an integrated air service with their Navy. It was land-based, but it had a lot of float planes and seaplanes, and it was actually quite effective. But the British separated the Air Force and the Navy portions of it, and they only allowed the Air Force to do special Air Force things, not Navy things. So that was a difference in doctrine. The British were big believers in convoy escorting, which if you're escorting a convoy, you're not fighting the Japanese. And the Japanese were pushing more and more and more. With the Dutch, there was also another problem. They were advanced in terms of air power, thanks in part to Karel Doorman, and I'll get to him in a second. And so they thought ahead. They peppered the Netherlands East Indies with airfields everywhere. And so when they needed to launch an air attack, they would move aircraft in there, and they could launch an attack. 2 problems. They don't have any aircraft, so they can't move into those air bases, and they also can't defend those air bases. So what ended up happening was the Japanese would land, and the air base would fall to the Japanese, and they would use it against the Dutch, which I must say, we did that at Guadalcanal. So this was a lesson learned at that point. Let's go to the next slide.
Let's jump in for a second, Jeff. I mean, I'm glad you're reminding everybody just how fractured and complicated and pulling in different directions this command is, because again, you talk about the fact we talk about the latter part of the war more often. We think about the combined forces for like Operation Torch or Operation Overlord. Everybody's going in the same direction. They've got the same idea. They've got the same aspirations, the same ambitions. And 42 just isn't that at all. 42 is everybody pulling in different directions.
Yes, it is. And as it was pointed out, ABDACOM was sort of a precursor for NATO. And we see what NATO is today. We're pulling in different directions, though we started pulling in the same direction thanks to the attack on Ukraine. It sort of focused everything as to the threat that the Russians posed, which is why NATO was created in the first place. We had forgotten that, and now we're being reminded of it. And even Germany, which had really cut its defense spending down, it's ratcheting up a bit to create a new Wehrmacht. Now, here I'm using Google Earth to just show where some of these places are, because most people can't. I understand you can't find them on a map. Most people couldn't. I couldn't when I was a kid. I just looked at these places so many times, and their names have changed, and in some cases the alphabets have changed. Yeah. So in this case, the Japanese were landing at a place called, I believe it's pronounced Balikpapan. It's on the coast of Borneo, the east coast. It has an oil field there and an oil refinery owned and operated by Royal Dutch Shell. Perhaps people have heard of it. I know we have quite a few shells around here. It's the same company. And the Japanese landed there, and they told the Dutch commander, "Don't you dare destroy the refinery." And the Dutch commander said, "Well, let's," the same thing the Ukrainian commander said at the Snake Island battle. And so they started burning the refinery and destroying all their installations there. And it set off a major fire that blew smoke across the Strait, across the Makassar Strait. And this would be very useful because, let's go to the next slide, please. We were putting together a counterattack, and we wanted to strike the Japanese at some point. And if we found that an invasion force, lying to somewhere, we could go in there and attack. And we put together a force of cruisers and destroyers to do it. Now, the destroyers were old. If you look at this photo, it's from late February 1942. As the caption says, the ship on the right of the foreground, not the ship way in back, but the ship in the right foreground is the USS Houston. She was that flagship of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. Most fleets have battleships as their flagships at that point, but the Asiatic Fleet was so small. She was the most powerful ship in the fleet in terms of gun power, and there was only one of her. And when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened and she got word of it, they had to immediately stop installing the radar on her foremast. And that radar would have been extremely useful, as it would turn out. Behind her is the destroyer Peary, and she's a very interesting character by herself. She survived the attack on Cavite Navy Yard by doing some pirouetting of her own. But she had a story just getting down to the Netherlands, East Indies, just getting down to Darwin, that was just bizarre. She was trying to hide from the Japanese, and she kept having trouble getting down there. And then she was accidentally bombed by Australian aircraft, and it was a complete mess. And she had severe issues getting to Darwin, but she got to Darwin for all the good that did. But if you look at her, she has 4 smokestacks. And the smokestacks are, they became the basis for their nickname, the Four Pipers. These were the Clemson class destroyers from the end of World War I. These were tweeners. These were very advanced destroyers for their time, but they came online too late for World War I and too early for World War II. And because the U.S. Navy considered the Philippines to be largely indefensible, they sent only the old ships to the Asiatic Fleet. Now, this is a bit interesting because the Asiatic Fleet was mostly a volunteer force. You had to tell people, hey, I want to go to the Asiatic Fleet, because it was the most exposed fleet that we had. So you had characters in there. You had people in there. They were boisterous. They were loud. They were also self-reliant. They were confident. And they had to be when you have ships like this. The destroyer was badly undergunned. She had almost no armor. but they had powerful torpedo batteries, a dozen torpedo batteries, and 6 on each side. So they could be useful ships, and they ended up being very useful in the war because we modified a lot of them to serve as minesweepers, mine layers, seaplane tenders, sub chasers, all kinds of stuff. These were extremely useful and modifiable ships, but for what they were designed to do as destroyers, they were kind of a problem. And that presented itself in this attack a little bit because the destroyers, we were assembling this force of cruisers and destroyers, and we wanted to have as many cruisers and destroyers as we could, and we would put it together, and then the invasion force wouldn't be there, and so we'd send all the ships back. Then another invasion force would show up, so let's get all the ships together and attack it. Well, it's not there, so they all go back again. And so finally found one off Balikpapan, and so we were able to slap together an attack force with the light cruiser Boise. And she was a light cruiser in name only because she had a very powerful rapid firing battery of 6-inch guns. And those cruisers, of which the Boise was a member of the class, they would factor largely in the Solomon's campaign. Not so much Guadalcanal, although some of them did fight there, but in the middle and upper Solomons, a lot of the Boise sister ships would fight. But the Boise did not want to be there. She had been escorting a convoy there when Pearl Harbor happened, and Hart asked the Navy to keep her with the Asiatic fleet, and the Navy agreed, but the Boise's captain was not happy about it, and he let everyone know. And arguably the Boise, because of her gun power, and she had radar, was more powerful than the Houston. There was also the light cruiser Marblehead. She was of the Omaha class. She was World War I. She was old. She was slow. And she actually looked like the USS Peary. And that would, the destroyers of the Peary's class, the Clemsons. And so that would play a little bit of a role later on. So they put together the Boise, the Marblehead, and 6 destroyers. Well, the Boise, she struck an uncharted reef. Rather convenient. Tore a hole in her hull. Well, she can't stay now. She's got to go back to a shipyard. And there are no shipyards here. So she's going to have to go back to Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people thought that was really convenient that it happened that way. So she was unavailable for this battle. Then the Marblehead suffered an engine failure. So she was unusable for this battle. And both of them took destroyer escorts. So that left 4 destroyers under Commander Paul Talbot to do the attack. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. This is what ended up happening. The Japanese were occupying Balikpapan with those fires and that smoke, as I explained. Their transports were parked offshore. They had a destroyer escorting force of a destroyer flotilla under Rear Admiral Nishimura Shoji, consisting of the light cruiser Naka and a bunch of destroyers. But a submarine had launched an attack earlier outside Balikpapan. It was a Dutch submarine. And it was a Dutch submarine under a very good commander. And so Nishimura went out there to go and look for him, pulled all the destroyers out of Balikpapan to go and search for the submarine. The submarine knew what it was doing, and it knew there was going to be attack, and so it sort of camped out there and said, yeah, let's watch this. Paul Talbot's destroyers went in behind the Japanese, who mistook those destroyers for their own, and they threaded their way through this unescorted invasion force sitting at anchor. And arguably, they should have done better. They also attacked with torpedoes, which really is what you should do. Torpedoes, they can launch quietly, and you may not even know their enemy ships are in the area when the torpedoes hit. And the Japanese understood this, and Paul Talbot understood this. And so he attacked the torpedoes first. Unfortunately, all of them missed in the first attack. So he tried again, and then he started getting some hits, and they started threading their way around these transports in and out. It was the Edwards, Ford, Paul Jones, and Parrott. The Pope, Parrott, Paul Jones, John D. Ford. And they went through there and just threaded their way in and out and launched torpedoes and then used their guns. And Admiral Nishimura kept thinking it was a submarine. So he kept looking for that submarine. The ship was saying, hey, we're being attacked by destroyers here. We got gunfire here. Nishimura was like, yeah, it's a submarine. Yeah, we're going after that submarine. And so Nishimura never really understood what was happening. And so our 4 destroyers left at that point. And with their torpedoes out, they met with the Marblehead, which is where the force's nominal commander, Admiral William Glassford, was. And this was a problem because Admiral Hart commanded the Asiatic Fleet. William Glassford was his subordinate, commander of what was called Task Force 5. They did not like each other. Admiral Hart was aggressive. Admiral Glassford was more of a politician. And after the problems of the Marblehead and an incident when they were coming down to the Java Sea area, when he refused to attack Japanese ships as he passed them, allegedly, that's the story. He was called 15-knot Glassford after the Marblehead's top speed. The crews did not seem to like him. So let's go to the next slide. That was the first U.S. naval victory since 1898.
Wow.
And that will factor in a little bit later on, but in a rather odd way. Now, Endau. This was a very curious operation. The Japanese were moving down the Malay Peninsula. The Japanese under General Yamashita Tomoyuki, who was really the best general the Imperial Japanese Army had. The Imperial Japanese Army was a bad army. And I don't mean bad in a Michael Jackson sort of way. It was bad. And you'd see later on when it would go against anyone who was even competently led, competently trained, competently supplied, it had serious issues. It would normally get its butt kicked. But in this Java Sea campaign, every force it was facing was in bad shape in at least one of those areas. And in the case of the British Army on Malaya, obviously the problem, I don't need to tell you, was leadership there. They were just stunningly inept and not in line with what you would expect from the British Army, which I will say it's the second best army in the world and has always given a good accounting of itself. It's a great army, and we are very proud to have Britain as allies, and half of my family comes from Yorkshire. So the Japanese were moving down the peninsula, and there was a report that they were landing at Endau in another attempt to outflank the British, who were retreating down the west coast. Endau is obviously, as this map shows, on the east coast. And as it turned out, the Japanese were not landing there. They were just doing some airfield scouting, and they sent 2 transports there. But, well, we were going to attack them anyway, so let's just go forward with the attack. This attack was called a Bloody Shambles, which was the title of one of those books you saw earlier. The British started out with air attacks with antiquated planes like the Wildebeest, and the Japanese were defending that Endau area. Let's go to the next slide. This was what was called a high-risk, low-reward operation because the British were largely slaughtered. They wasted most of their remaining air assets in this air attack that accomplished nothing. It was just like 2 Japanese transports surrounded by a destroyer flotilla under Admiral Hashimoto, with the light cruiser Sendai and some destroyers, one of which would become particularly famous, called the Amagiri. And this air attack, it failed, but it was to be combined with a night sortie by British ships to sort of a Balikpapan sort of way, attack the Japanese in this little tiny anchorage. So the Japanese aren't landing here. The British are attacking it like they are, and they're getting beaten up. And the worst part was, this was an operation for which the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were really suited for what they should have been saved for, something like this, in the absence of, again, any orders from London. But there are no ships, there are no Prince of Wales or Repulse anymore. So they sent the destroyers Vampire and, is it pronounced Thanet? I've never seen it pronounced.
Thanet, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so they send them in there. Well, they're not the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. And so they go in there and they accomplish very little except getting the Thanet sunk. Again, low risk, the high risk, low reward. And this was an example of something that really shouldn't have been done. Let's go to the next slide. This would be the primary base for ABDAFLOAT, was at Surabaya, which is spelled a lot different today than it was back then. But I think the Dutch spelling looks it looks cool. But it is pronounced Surabaya. The harbor there is called Perak. And this was the primary Navy base for the Dutch East Indies Squadron. Let's go to the next slide. And this was a big development in the campaign that was very bad. The Dutch had one of those airfields that I told you about. It was called Kendari 2. And on this map, it's at where that little yellow marker is. The Kendari airfield is not in Kendari itself, but you get it, sort of all that. The U.S. had just dropped off about 30,000 gallons of aviation fuel to the Kendari airfield. Then the Japanese promptly took it. And Kendari was a great airfield. It was paved. It was one of the best airfields in Asia. And then if you look at that little body of water on the lower right-hand corner, that's called Staring Bay. That was a great anchorage for the Japanese ships. And this would play a role in the campaign to come. Next slide, please. And if you can look at this, if you can see it on there, Kendari is on Celebes, that island, and Surabaya on Java. The Japanese aircraft have the range to make that to the primary Dutch Navy base. And so they start attacking in early February. They start making like daily bombing raids on the Surabaya Navy base. Next slide, please. And again, these fights are not equal. The Japanese come with Japanese Zeros. That's the one on the left. That's the early model Zero. Again, that's why we give it nicknames. The Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 21 Navy Type 00 carrier fighter doesn't really roll off the tongues. So we would codename it Zeke, but everyone just called it a Zero because that's what its name was. The primary defenses in these areas were the antiquated Dutch fighters, but also we had a provisional squadron of Army Air Force flyers with the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. That's what they were armed with. And I must point out that the Japanese Zeros, the reports on them coming in from China earlier on, from Claire Lee Chenot's American Volunteer Group, he warned everyone about the Zeros, what they were capable of. We didn't listen because we were racist and we didn't think the Japanese could do anything like that. Plus, the leadership didn't like Claire Lee Chenot. So the Japanese Zeros are a major shock to us in terms of their ability to dogfight, low-speed maneuvering, and ability to climb. And what we have is the P-40 Warhawk, which is kind of our equivalent of the British Hawker Hurricane. Not really spectacular, but it's reliable, it's tough, It's easy to fly. And I must say, the P-40 Warhawk, it did have its problems at times, but those problems were solved mostly by, obviously, the shark mouth. Because any fighter, any aircraft with a shark mouth is much more effective. It's also simple when you break it down scientifically. And that shark mouth makes all the difference. But they couldn't climb fast enough to engage the Zeros and engage the bombers before they got to Surabaya. And because they didn't have a turbocharger, they couldn't catch the fast Betty bombers as they flew away. So it was not a good situation at Surabaya. Let's go to the next slide, please. Those photos, I took them at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. I highly recommend going there. That's one of my favorite places. It is a lot of fun. You have all kinds of aircraft there. Next slide.
Brilliant.
Karel Doorman. Karel Doorman would become the principal figure associated with the naval portion of the Java Sea campaign. He was the battlefield commander, which I used guardedly with a combat on water for the Dutch East Indies Squadron. He was chosen because the Hart wanted to have politically a Dutch admiral in charge of combat in Dutch waters. Doorman was actually an aviator, and he was very familiar with air power. And he had been involved in the pioneering of aviation and in setting up the Dutch Naval Air Service. He was involved in training Dutch pilots, and he had been involved in at least 30 emergency landings. And his courage will be called into question later, but it really shouldn't be when you're talking about someone who landed aircraft in 30 emergencies. He was a highly intelligent, respected individual, known for his charm, known for his ability to drink voluminous quantities without getting drunk. But he also seems to have been a bit of an introvert, and he didn't seem to have a lot of friends around him. He was very well respected by his subordinates and his sailors, but he was a very private person. He didn't share a lot of what he was thinking or planning with other people, and that would play a bit of a role in the campaign and in the history of it, discussed later on. Next slide, please. Okay. When the Japanese were over Surabaya, they saw the Dutch ships in the roads off of it, and the American ships for what was hoped to be another Balikpapan operation. But this one would strike the Japanese off Makassar City in Celebes. And so we were forming up with the heavy cruiser Houston, light cruiser Marblehead, the De Ruyter, and probably the most capable Dutch ship in the East Indies, which was the light cruiser / destroyer leader / big destroyer Tromp, which had 6-inch guns, like 5.9 inch or something, but also torpedo tubes, and she was very fast. And so they hoped to do something along the lines of a Balikpapan operation. The Japanese saw them, and the Japanese attacked. And it might be seen as kind of a turning point in the campaign, because the Japanese had all these Betty bombers overhead. They were bombing the ships, dropping the bombs, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. There were no fighters. All the ships could do was just turn around, keep spinning. The Marblehead took several hits and near misses that left her rudder jammed, that left her shipping in water by the bow. The Dutch cruiser De Ruyter lost her fire control system. The Houston took a rather critical bomb hit here, and you can see the evidence of it. It's a little bit hard. The Marblehead had struggled back into port, and she was passing the Houston at this point in this photo. You can see that the turret, that's the aft turret, the aft 8-inch turret, is trained to port. It's facing the port quarter. A bomb went through the main mast there, bounced off a couple of times, and it hit near that 8-inch turret. And what it ended up doing was it started a fire on the turret. It killed everyone in there. And it was just very lucky that the fire did not reach the magazines below it. But it disabled the turret completely, killed about 50 people. And so this photo shows the turret being trained, and they're trying to put it back in position so it at least looks operational. But to repair it, it would have to go to a shipyard. The user would have to go to a shipyard, and they couldn't spare her. So she stayed there, probably with the acquiescence of Captain Rooks, her skipper. These sailors are lining up alongside the Houston and clapping as the Marblehead went in there because she had struggled to sail after the hits that she took. She was shipping water. They had to keep shipping the water out with no breaks. Bucket brigades, no breaks for the bathroom, no breaks for eating. They had to do that constantly until she got back to this port. And next slide, please. And here's more evidence of where the Marblehead was hit by the stern. The turret was inoperable. Her rudder was inoperable. Next slide, please. And this is where they went. It's called Chilachap. TJ in Dutch is sort of the equivalent of CH. And that was the only port, that is the only port on the south coast of Java. It's now spelled with Cilatjap, as you can see in here. But it's still pronounced the same way, Chilachap. It's a little bit difficult to get into because it's twisty and it's not as open as Surabaya was, but the Japanese could not bomb Chilachap yet. So this was used as a new staging area. The Dutch had put a small floating dry dock here, and the Marblehead wouldn't fit in the floating dry dock. So they kind of stuck her bow in there and lifted it up and all this other stuff. But she was unfit for combat and she had to be sent home. Next slide. And things were continuing to go bad after that. The bombing attack, which took place in the Flores Sea, that seems to have affected Admiral Doorman and affected him seriously. He saw the air attacks. He knew what air power could do, and he did not like losing men under his command. He seems to have taken it very personally. He seems to have been shaken by what happened there. And my guess is at that point, he was convinced that unless they could get some aircraft, the campaign was lost. And it was hard on him. He went around and met Admiral Helfrich about it. Hart was not happy about that because he felt Helfrich was keeping things from him. And then the campaign just started going so badly that the U.S. Navy said, okay, Hart, get out of there. Put Helfrich in charge. He wants to be in charge. Let's put him in charge. So Helfrich was in charge, and he wasn't going to let any ship leave if he could. And so Doorman was sent out on another operation. This is Palembang on Sumatra, which is the most western of the major islands of Indonesia, the East Indies. Palembang had two airfields called P1 and P2, or Palembang 1, Palembang 2. It was also the site of several oil refineries, several oil fields. One refinery was owned by Standard Vacuum Oil. I don't know what vacuum has to do with oil, but I think it's now Mobil Exxon. And so the Japanese wanted to capture it. And they were actually able to do a seaborne invasion because they had done their homework. They knew the river was navigable up to Palembang. And so they sent ships up there to help land the force. There were also some Japanese paratroopers there. So Admiral Doorman sortied to try to stop this force. Let's go to the next slide. Stop the Japanese. This Doorman's force this time had the De Ruyter, it had the Exeter, the Tromp had a bunch of destroyers, and the Japanese found him. And so they started bombing him. Next slide, please. Not a lot was accomplished by the Japanese. They didn't hit anybody. They had a near miss when one on the Exeter. This is the British cruiser Exeter. She was famous for battling the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee off of the River Plate, Montevideo. And she had been repaired after that. And now she was sent out east. And once again, she was giving a good account of herself. She was a very good cruiser, very well run, a little bit undergunned, but she was aggressively handled here. The Japanese managed to disable her float plane, critical. later on, but they got no hits. Here, there would be another example, however, of the penchant during this campaign for a lot of these Allied ships to be lost, not to combat, but to operational accidents or, just freaky things happening to them. And this was another one of those cases. You had the Marblehead disabled with the engine. You had the Boise run aground. In this operation, you had the Dutch destroyer Van Gent run aground, and they could not pull her off. And so she was left there. They tried to scuttle her, that she wouldn't go down. The Japanese ended up attacking her and setting her afire. So this continued in that, just in that vein. The destroyer Van Gent's crew was taken off, and they were transferred to another sister ship, the Witte Withe, because she didn't have a crew. And so she had apparently just been kept there and just maintained. And so this is where the Witte Withe appears on the scene. Next slide, please. This is another part of the bombing of the Bangka Strait. Bomb off Palembang. That's where a bomb lands near the HRMS. That's the Dutch word for Java, the old cruiser that I told you about. It was at this time that Singapore fell, because these attacks took place on the 15th, and that was the day Singapore fell to the Japanese after an absolutely idiotic defense by General Percival, and just inexplicably bad, and some great bluffing by General Yamashita. And so this was a very bitter pill to swallow for the British, as it should be, but it was even worse for ABDACOM, this whole Allied organization. The British were demoralized by the loss of Singapore, and they felt with no Singapore on the left flank that the East Indies were indefensible. The Dutch were like, well, no, we can still defend them. We still need your help. We gave you all of our ships for you to use when you needed them to help with the defense of Singapore. So now we need you to return the favor. And the British are like, well, it's not going to do any good. We're not going to throw good ships away to defend something indefensible. So take your pick. Either the British were being sensible with the ships and realizing the campaign was lost, or the Dutch were being kind of screwed because they had given their ships over to the British to help them with the Singapore campaign. And now the British were not returning the favor. So you had that tension going in there. Next slide, please. Darwin, Australia's Pearl Harbor is what it's called. Japanese carrier striking force was floating around there. They had some accidents of their own. I think the Kaga ran aground. But Darwin had been set up as a staging area for ABDACOM. It was 1,200 miles away from the nearest base in the Indies. But it was the most secure place that we had. And Darwin was sort of the Australian version of the Wild West in the U.S. It was mostly isolated. It didn't even have a rail line that went up there. Mostly could get there only by ship. But we had started putting aircraft there. Darwin was not set up for port facilities. It had an L-shaped dock that nobody could really handle. It had very big tides. And again, it was just the best we had, the best that was available. So we started sending all the shipping there to build up supply caches, sending aircraft there to forward them to the front line in Java, especially, and in Bali, as it turned out. But Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force, Kido Butai, what it was called, the same force that attacked Pearl Harbor, though not with all the carriers in it. They showed up off of Timor, and they launched a surprise air attack, and it was devastating. Next slide, please. And this was one of the instances of it. There were ammunition ships in the harbor, like the Barossa and Neptuna, and with gasoline and aviation fuel. They were set afire and had spectacular explosions. Next slide, please. And again, one of the tankers there the British motorist. It was sinking. And to the right is the destroyer Peary. I say in the book that the Peary was moving around, and that's not the case. That's how I remembered it from a kid, and I wrote that up. But she was actually anchored, and she never really got underway. And so after going all this way from the Cavite Navy Yard, and that had been bombed, having that bombed out from under her, having to hide from the Japanese during the day, sail at night, then getting bombed by Australian planes, she finally makes it to the safety of Darwin, and there she's sunk by Kido Butai. And it was really just a tragic fate for the Peary, who really, she had been through so much, and she should have been safe here, but she wasn't. There's actually another photo somewhere of one of the British hurricanes. There were like only 6 or maybe a dozen hurricanes at the Darwin airfield. You're not going to defend against Kido Butai with a dozen hurricanes. And one of them is shown flying upside down, trying to engage the Japanese as best they can. This was Australia's Pearl Harbor. This attack was so bad, the Australians abandoned Darwin. That's how bad this was. And it's still remembered in Australia. Next slide, please. Bali. Bali is the island to the east of Java. Java is the economic and political heart of the East Indies and of Indonesia. Sumatra and Borneo, they have a lot of the oil. Java does not. Borneo has a lot of rainforest. Sumatra actually has a separatist area of called Aceh, and Aceh gave the Dutch trouble, and they're still giving trouble today. They want to be separatists. Java has places that were hurt by the volcano Krakatoa, which I go into a little bit in my second book. But it should be pointed out here that while the Americans had the support of the Filipinos in fighting in the Philippines, and the British had largely the support of the native population in Malaysia, the Dutch did not have the support at all of the people of Indonesia. There were a lot of competing sectarian groups, but a lot of larger ones did not like the Dutch. The Dutch had to bring in infantry from places like Ambon and Timor, because those people were considered more friendly to the Dutch than they were on Java. And the population was largely, at best, indifferent or even hostile to the Dutch. And that state of affairs actually started with the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, because the native population was both disgusted with the Dutch response to it and convinced the Dutch didn't care about them, and also convinced that the Dutch were not liked by the gods of Krakatoa. And the Muslims also thought that it was a sign of the 12th Imam coming. So there were some Dutch atrocities committed to put down the uprisings that resulted from this. And Krakatoa seems to have been a bit of a shatter point, where the Dutch relations with the native peoples of Indonesia started going way downhill after that. It was a long slide. But at this point, the Dutch did not have the support of the natives of Indonesia. And that came out here. Bali was the site of the Denpasar airfield. Denpasar is a town on Bali, and it became famous when there was a volcano on Bali that erupted, and it was covering the Denpasar airfield, so people are having trouble getting off. And the Japanese came in, and they captured this airfield very quickly. The Dutch had some native troops defending it, and the native troops just ran away. So the Japanese took control of the airfield, and with this airfield, they officially cut off Java from Darwin, from the supply staging area. There was no way to get aircraft to Darwin now, to Java now. There was a lot of the reinforcements would be cut off because the Japanese would be operating from the Denpasar airfield. So we decided that we were going to attack the Japanese invasion force by Denpasar. And it's between where we were going to go was between two of the islands. You can see Denpasar in that photo, and then there's a body of water to the right of it, and then there's the island there. That's where this battle would be fought. But all of our ships were scattered, and so we had to attack in 3 different waves. The first one had the Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter, Admiral Doorman on board, then the Java and the destroyers P-Tyne and Kortner, and the U.S. destroyers Pope and Ford. And so they were the first wave. They were going to sweep in there, fire their guns, and then clear out so the destroyers could fire torpedoes. Now, you might have noticed that this is a little bit reversed for what it should be. You should fire the torpedoes first to try to catch the enemy by surprise so they can't avoid them, and then you fire the guns. Well, we had this reversed. And the Dutch were the ones that had it reversed. We had it reversed. So the Dutch went by there, and there were really no invasion ships left. They had already emptied, and they were just getting to sail off. Our attack force was reduced by one destroyer when the Kortner ran aground outside of Chillicothe. Another one of those operational accidents. And so we swept by. The Japanese the cruiser swept by, shooting at the Japanese and not really hitting anything. Then the Japanese destroyers there, including the Ashio, commanded by a guy named Kikawa, who would become fairly famous in the Pacific War as a Japanese commander. They blocked the exit to the north of the American destroyer, of the destroyers P-Tyne, Pope, and Ford. And so a vicious gun and torpedo battle ensued, and the P-Tyne was sunk by torpedoes. There's some question as to whether she was sunk by the Japanese or accidentally sunk by American torpedoes. But it's a weird story where she ended up launching a smoke screen that actually protected the Japanese. She had been doing some maneuvers, and someone accidentally hit the smoke screen machine, and so she made smoke that protected the Japanese, and the Ford may have thought she was a Japanese ship because of that. That's the theory. Either way, she was sunk. That was not good. The Pope and the Ford could not get through, so they turned away and went back home. The second wave came in with the Tromp and a bunch of destroyers, and the Japanese destroyers riddled them again, and they beat up the Tromp, and she was the best Dutch ship available, so she ended up having to be sent back. The destroyer Stuart was also hit at that time, and we hadn't touched anything of the Japanese. We had not really damaged anything. We were going up the Strait, and we ended up damaging one of the destroyers, but it didn't really accomplish anything. And so then there was a third wave of Dutch PT boats. They didn't see anybody. Denpasar's gone. Bally's gone. Basically, ABDACOM's gone. The Dutch everything's turned over to the Dutch at this point because the British are convinced it's lost. And it is lost at this point, but the Dutch want to keep fighting, and that's understandable. It's their land. This is with the Netherlands under Nazi occupation. This is basically their homeland. So next slide, please. That was called the Battle of the Badong Strait, or it could be the Battle of the Lombok Strait, or it could be the Battle of Bali. There are all kinds of things you could call this one. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, these are the Dutch ships involved. The De Ruyter was the Dutch flagship, and I use that term sort of guardedly because she wasn't really a very good ship, but she looked cool. And that really matters. I mean, you have the coolness factor of ships that really sort of adds to their performance. And the coolness factor of the De Ruyter here was that big bridge tower that she had. It made her look like the Bismarck. Now, if they had made her a little bit bigger, maybe they could have mistaken her for the Bismarck and the Japanese would have been scared. But she was the Dutch flagship there. 3 guns in the front, 4 guns facing back. She was not a well-designed ship, and it would come out later just how poorly she had been designed. Next slide, please. This was the Java, which they had the Java and the Sumatra, sister ships, old. You see no turrets on her. You see 10 guns, all in single mounts. And she could not fire all of her guns at once because she couldn't get all of her guns facing the same direction because some of her guns were on the other side. They'd have to fire through the ship. but she was the best the Dutch had, and they couldn't even get her sister ship crewed properly. Next slide, please. Oh, and here comes another one of those operational accidents. The destroyer USS Stewart. She had been damaged at Badong Strait. So they went to Surabaya, which was still under, Japanese attacks every day. And slowly but surely, the anti-aircraft guns defending Surabaya, they were knocked out or they were abandoned. And so the only people defending Surabaya were the ships at the Perak Navy base. There was a floating dry dock there. The Stewart had some light damage from Badong Strait. She was put in there. And so they put keel blocks under her and they started raising the dry dock, and she rolled over. They hadn't braced her properly. And there was some question as to whether the Japanese had got to the native crews. This was a civilian dry dock, and I wonder if they had too, but that doesn't seem to have been considered a whole lot. But she rolled over there. She's at about, she ended up at about a 45-degree angle, and there was no way to fix her. There's really no way to fix the dry dock either. So she was stuck there. She was wrecked. They couldn't get her out. They couldn't fix her. This was one of the worst of the operational accidents that happened. Next slide, please. And here is one of the fallout of the Bali occupation, trying to get aircraft to the Netherlands East Indies. By this point, the Dutch in command were desperate for aircraft. They needed anything they could get because the Japanese were coming in so close. They were cutting off Java at this point. You can see Bali to the east of Java, Sumatra to the west. Java is largely cut off. But there were some aircraft in the area. Some crated aircraft were aboard a ship called the Sea Witch. Not the Sandwich, the Sea Witch. And some were aboard the Langley that I had told you about earlier, the seaplane tender. And we decided to, the fighters, these were P-40 Warhawks. The ones aboard the Sea Witch were crated. They would have to be assembled. Good luck assembling aircraft quickly enough to get them airborne. But the Langley, she had ready to fly P-40s. They were just sitting there on the deck, and she looked like an aircraft carrier. That was not good because the Japanese saw her with all those aircraft on deck, and there were some stowed beneath. And they thought, the Americans are sending an aircraft carrier. You might want to do something about this. But the Langley was going to be diverted to Cilacap on the south coast, which is interesting by itself because Cilacap has no airfield. So what was going to happen was they were going to take the aircraft onto the quay and tow them through town to someplace, a bare field where they could take off to the nearest airfield. And so they were involved, excuse me, in tearing down trees, tearing down streetlights, pulling down cranes, anything they could do to smooth things over so the planes could be moved as quickly as possible. You're not going to hide that. If there were any Japanese agents in Cilacap, they would have seen it right then and there. Although the Japanese said that they didn't know that the ship was coming in with P-40s. But they did find her south of Java. And next slide, please. And this was truly embarrassing by the way this was handled. She was supposed to get into Cilacap under cover of night, but she was also supposed to have an escort, an anti-submarine escort. The problem is the anti-submarine escort had engine issues. And so she was slowing down the Langley. The Langley fell behind schedule. She wanted to push on ahead. She was denied that right. And so eventually she was met by the destroyers Whipple and Edsall, but by that point she was hopelessly behind schedule. And so the Japanese found her. This was another part about competing doctrines, competing ideologies here. There was a belief that submarines, and the Dutch were big into submarines, so they may have overestimated just how much they needed to protect them from submarines. The Langley was caught in daylight by Japanese from Bali, and she was sunk. No one knows quite when she was sunk. She was hit by bombs that had secondary effects in the engine room that left her disabled, but she wasn't quite sinking. The Whipple and the Edsall picked up all the survivors, and then they basically left her to sink alone. It's not known when she sank. She sank sometime during the night, but she did sink. So she went out like a pioneer. She went out alone into the sunset. That this was really an embarrassment to the U.S. Navy and to the Royal Netherlands Navy as to how badly this was handled. Next slide, please.
I'm just going to interject here because back in the 80s and 90s in Britain, we had a wonderful series of adverts for Carlsberg beer, where the joke was always, if Carlsberg did, and that was it was going to be brilliant. So I'm going to say, if Carlsberg did introductions to a battle, you've just won it there, because we've now finally got to the meat of the meal. But that was an incredible introduction to the battle we're now going to discuss. Absolutely masterclass. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And this is a topic I have a lot of passion for. I love the Pacific War, and I have to say to people, as bad as this campaign is, as bad as a lot of history is, because history is really the study of wars, I have to say this: history is fun. History is fun. It is funny, and there was no reason to suck the fun and the joy out of it. It is fun to study. This is a sad campaign, but it is good to get these people attention.
Yeah.
What they went through, their sacrifices, the sacrifices they made, and I just enjoy doing it. I enjoy talking about it. I enjoy writing about it. And I think that we need more people studying military history, more people studying history and realizing just how rich it is, just how colorful it is. You see, stuff you see on Game of Thrones, that stuff happened in history, in real life, except for the dragon parts, I think. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, we're at the point now where the Japanese are about to attack Java. And they have two convoys coming in, one from the west, one from the east. The west is headed for Batavia, which is now known as Jakarta. Batavia, the Dutch named it after these Roman troops who really did not perform well at the Battle of Adrianople. The eastern convoy is headed for the area of Surabaya. And we don't have enough ships to fight both of them. So what happened was we sent the British ships that were at Batavia, at Tanjung Priok. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm not sure. That's the port of Batavia. We sent them to Surabaya to combine with the American and Dutch ships there and to form what was called the Combined Striking Force. The ABDA Combined Striking Force, even though there was no longer an ABDA. This was called, right now, it was called the Unified Command. So if anyone remembers the 1990s when the Soviet Union broke up and they called it the Unified Team, I like to call this the Unified Team because it's the Unified Team. But there's no time to train. There's no time to fix the ships. We lost a destroyer at this point to use because the Pope suffered a leak in her hot well, so she had to stay in Surabaya with welding issues to get it fixed up again. They had an air attack, and so they had to meet at a power plant's conference room. Doorman had met with Helfrich, and he expressed his doubts about the campaign, and Helfrich and the others had expressed their doubts about Doorman, but he was kept in command because you really don't want to change commands on the eve of a battle. It's a bad thing. So we slapped these ships together, and we slapped a plan together with no knowledge of where the Japanese were or where they're going to land. And the ships were heavy cruisers, USS Houston, minus her aft turret, British cruiser HMS Exeter, minus her float plane, Dutch light cruisers Java and De Ruyter, Australian light cruiser Perth, under the command of Hector Waller, Dutch destroyers Kortner, with her suffering engine issues because of that grounding, and the Vitivith, British destroyers Electra, personally my favorite ship, the Electra. I just love the name. Electra, Encounter, and Jupiter. And the American destroyers, all the four Pipers, Edwards, Alden, the John D. Edwards, the Alden, the John D. Ford, and the Paul Jones. And so we threw all these ships together in a pot. We had them meet in a conference room for 30 minutes or an hour discussing things. And then, and afterwards, the U.S. destroyer commander, Thomas Binford, he would criticize the Dutch and said that, well, you can't go to battle after a 30-minute conference. You need more than that. The Dutch had no experience with battles, obviously. Otherwise, they would know you can't go into this with a 30-minute conference. And my response to that, and I'm an American, my response to that is the Americans didn't really have a whole lot of experience in naval battles at this point either, at least in the modern era, because our last naval battle had been in 1898. Plus, when the Japanese are 24 hours away and you have ships just coming in and you have to get out to meet them, what choice do you have? You have to find them in battle. There's no choice. You have to stop them. And so the plan here was for the combined striking force to go out, destroy the eastern invasion convoy, and destroy the western invasion convoy. And I need to say this because this plays critically here. Helfrich's orders to Doorman were, you are to continue your attacks until the enemy is destroyed. Now remember that, because when you have invasion convoys getting in and you need to buy time, you don't necessarily need to destroy them. You need to repulse them. And there are many more ways to repulse these forces than there are to destroy them. We're talking about a convoy of like 50 transports here. And next slide, please. Okay, this is the cruiser Perth. She's going in the Indian Ocean on the way to Java, and she looks really, really pretty. Next slide, please. This is one of the Japanese cruisers. And this was how bad things turned out for the Dutch. The Dutch had very bad luck. The striking force went out from Surabaya. It swept the north coast of Java, couldn't find anything, had a few air attacks, including one by a B-17. And so Doorman said his crews were exhausted. I'm going to go into Surabaya and get some sleep for the crews. He was keeping them at battle stations constantly, and hopefully get some better information on the Japanese. Just as he was crossing the minefield in Surabaya through the swept channel, he got that information the Japanese were 90 miles away. So he turned around. He turned around into the minefield and didn't hit any mines. Now, the Dutch were big on mines, and it kind of makes me wonder just how well laid this minefield was. And there'd be more questions about minefields later on. And so the Dutch went out there to try to get to the convoy. The Japanese, meanwhile, were getting arrogant. They were getting arrogant, overconfident, and sloppy. And this battle ended up being an instance of it. And here's why. The Japanese invasion convoy had a destroyer flotilla under Rear Admiral Tanaka Raizo. He'd be famous in the Guadalcanal campaign. He was a very good destroyer commander. He one of the best of the war, although the Japanese later didn't think so, probably because he was very outspoken. He had the light cruiser Jitsu, which was old, and a bunch of destroyers. Then there was Admiral Nishimura, and he had the Naka and a bunch of destroyers. But the Nishimura was behind. Tanaka had his destroyer flotilla. The cruisers that were meant to escort the transports, they were called the 5th Cruiser Division. It's actually Sentai 5 was the Japanese term. It's actually Section 5 or Squadron 5. We interpreted that as the 5th Cruiser Division. And it had 2 cruisers in it at this point. Their sister ships, the Nashi and Haguro, under the command of Admiral Takeo Takagi. Takeo. I keep reversing the names now. And he was about 200 miles behind the convoy. Now, this is something the Japanese would do when they were trying to escort something, especially something defenseless. They would have the ships with the war power, the gun power behind them. Now, it makes sense to a certain extent where if you have these invasion transports in the front, they get sunk, but your warships don't. So if you're trying to protect the warships, that's a good thing. But Takagi, he was like, yeah, the Americans aren't going to show up. The odds are going to show up. They've been beaten. And then his scout plane, and these are big. The Japanese love their float planes. There is nothing that they would not try to do with float planes. The float planes were the Japanese version of cowbell. Now, they had a fever, and the only prescription was more seaplanes. That was it. And they would launch seaplanes willy-nilly left and right. They do all kinds of weird things with seaplanes. And they had a seaplane watching the Dutch, the combined striking force. And the seaplane saw the combined striking force turn around. And Takagi had thought that the combined striking force had been going back into port to avoid the air attack, and he was laughing about it. Then he gets the word from his scout plane that the combined striking force had turned around to go back out to sea. His mood starts sinking a little bit, and the crewmen around him start laughing because they realize he had been pretty arrogant, pretty and sloppy. And so the Nachi and the Haguro have to race on ahead. And typical of the Dutch luck, they get there just as the De Ruyter and the other ships sight the Japanese. And the Dutch could not catch a break. ABDACOM could not catch a break. And so the Battle of the Java Sea commences. Next slide, please. And these were the Japanese commanders involved. 4th Destroyer Flotilla, Admiral Nishimura, Admiral Takagi, he was the commander overall, and then Admiral Tanaka. You would hear from Nishimura and Tanaka a lot during the war. Takagi, he was more of a submarine guy, and that would come out in this operation a little bit. Next slide, please. So this is how the Battle of the Java Sea started. The combined striking force, they have no time to train together. They have no time to develop or distribute an operational plan. They have no time to arrange communications codes. They're dead tired. They've had no maintenance. And so basically all that you can do at this point is have Admiral Doorman lead the other ships and say, follow me. And so that's what happens. We have the De Ruyter leading the Exeter, followed by the Houston, the Perth, and the Java. The 3 British destroyers are in front. The Dutch destroyers are on the port side, and they were trying to get up to the front, but they couldn't because the Kortner was having engine issues, and the 4 U.S. destroyers were trying to get up to the front, but they couldn't pass the Dutch because they were ordered not to. And so all those destroyers ended up being behind, which was kind of useless. But that's another of those communications issues. The Japanese are in 3 squadrons. Cruiser Division 5 is in between the 2 destroyer flotillas. This formation would actually come up again in the war. It would come up the same formation would be used at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay with some of the same ships involved, this 5th Cruiser Division, in fact. So the Japanese are racing forth, and the Dutch are trying to intercept them, with Doorman just leading the ships, and they start engaging in a high-speed, long-range gun duel between the Exeter and the Houston on one side and the Nachi and the Haguro on the other. But no one hits anybody because they're going too fast and they're at too long a range. And plus, in the case of the combined striking force, we can't even agree on who to attack. Again, different doctrines. Should the Exeter attack the Nachi and the Houston the Haguro, or should the Exeter and the Houston both attack either the Nachi or the Haguro? Match 1-to-1 or have 2-on-1 to try to get one knocked out. Competing doctrines again. There was no time to resolve it. Again, this was slapped together. They didn't have time for anything else. They had no time to train, and this was the best they could do. On paper, the combined striking force looked fairly powerful and like it could match the Japanese, but it was like House of Cards. And you pull one card out, or even shake it, and the House of Cards is going to collapse. And that's exactly what happened. The Japanese, next slide, please. The Japanese were trying to do something called crossing the T. And this involves, use this example, the Nachi and the Haguro were in a column up front. They were perpendicular to the combined striking force with the De Ruyter, Exeter, Houston, Perth, and Java. Now, from this, this perspective, the Japanese could use all of their guns, while the combined striking force could only fire with their forward guns. So it's considered a bad thing. It's basically you're outgunned at that point, and simply a matter of positioning. It's worse than that, though, in one aspect, because really only the Ruyter could fire ahead. The other ships would either have to fire over her and not be able to see because nobody had radar, or they'd have to fire to the sides of them and disperse the fire a bit. But the biggest problem with having someone crossing your T, as the Japanese were threatening to do in this case, was that if someone crossed your T, your manhood would be questioned. It'd be like, what? You let him cross your T? What kind of an officer? What kind of a man are you? You let him cross your T? That's bad. And so it was drummed into the heads of Navy officers at this time. Don't ever let him cross your T. Don't ever let him do it. And go back a slide. And Admiral Doorman was stuck. He didn't want his T being crossed. However, he needed to close the range into the Japanese so he could bring his 6-inch guns in. They were outrange at this time, and he couldn't launch them with anything. So he was stuck, and he tried to split the difference here to close the range little by little while continuing the gunfight. And then he would eventually bring his 6-inch guns in. And so you see that he split the angle there a little bit. But this is where things went wrong. The Exeter, second in line there, she took a hit and it severed a steam line to her engine room. And so it started pouring forth white smoke. And she turned out of line because her speed had been immediately cut in half and she didn't want the Houston behind her running her over. The problem was she was spewing so much smoke, no one could see the Ruyter ahead of her, so everyone thought he had ordered a turn, either called a ship's turn or what I call it as a line turn, that everyone needed to turn at the same time. They couldn't see him through the smoke. And so all the ships turned at the same time, or right after the Exeter did, and Doorman's charging on ahead with the Ruyter, and he's getting ready to fire at the Japanese, and he looks behind him and sees no one following him. That's rather dispiriting. So he turned around and he started, and this is where the battle fell apart. Communications, information, no time to train together, no time to develop a coherent plan. Let's go next slide and the slide after that. Okay. The Exeter turns out of line. She's in big trouble. The Japanese decide to go for the kill, and they launch a torpedo attack. And this is what they do. They launch a mass torpedo attack. The light cruisers leading their destroyers, and they all fire torpedoes at once. And the Japanese have reloads. Normally, navies don't carry torpedo reloads. It's not like Star Trek where you can fire as many proton torpedoes as you can store inside the hull. Not like Star Wars, you can fire proton torpedoes. You got one set of torpedoes, you fire them, and that's it. Here, the Japanese launched a whole bunch of torpedoes. You have all of the combined striking forces, ships milling around. They don't know what's going on. Doorman's coming back. He's flying a signal flag that means follow me. And he became famous for this signal, follow me. That became sort of his saying and his rallying cry, follow me, follow me, follow me. But until he could get there, all the ships are milling around like cows in a field. And one of the torpedoes the Japanese launch, it's not clear from whom. There's some dispute as to it. It hit the destroyer Kortner, and it turned her into a jackknife. And she rolled over, jackknifed, and sank within the space of about a minute. So that's one destroyer gone. Captain Waller of the Perth realizes what's going on with the Exeter, that she's in trouble. He lays a smoke screen. Now, this is something the Americans don't understand because for some reason we were opposed to smoke screens. We wouldn't lay smoke screens. The Japanese were big on smoke screens. The British were big on smoke screens. We didn't lay a whole lot of smoke screens during really any part of the war. And I'm not sure why. But we lay the smoke screens, and then Doorman signal and the Exeter is sort of protected. The problem with that is that the Japanese had float planes. And these were not just any float planes, these were spotter planes. These were observation seaplanes. They were intended and trained for spotting for gunfire. So the Japanese could fire through the smoke, but again, spotted fire is not as good, and not as fast, not as accurate as fire you can see yourself. But the Exeter is surrounded by the smoke screen. Doorman signals counterattack. And so there's a counterattack led by the destroyers Electra, Jupiter and Vit, and the Electra charges through the smoke screen and ends up facing Admiral Tanaka's entire destroyer flotilla. She manages to actually disable one of the Japanese destroyers, the Asagumo, for a little bit. But she took an early hit in the engine room, and so she couldn't really fire her torpedoes. And then she was just pounded and sunk at that point. She basically just disappeared. And another one of those operational accidents comes in at this point. The Vit, she, because these torpedoes came from so far away, we didn't think the Japanese had launched them. The Type 93, we were not familiar with its specs until like late 1943, almost 2 years later. And so we think, man, there got to be submarines here. So we better start dropping some depth charges. So the Vit starts getting her depth charges ready, and one of them's washed over the side and detonates under her stern, damaging her propellers. So she's assigned to escort the Exeter back to Surabaya. Doorman keeps trying to poke around, trying to get around these warships to where he thinks the convoy is. It's just basically a thrust and parry, but it's a long thrust and parry show. But he lost one of his most powerful ships in the Exeter, and so now he's in big trouble. So he keeps poking around, and he decides to break off contact to try to get around them, try to surprise the Japanese. And this happens as dusk is approaching. And what he does is he orders the U.S. destroyers, 4 U.S. destroyers, to, quote, cover my retirement. And Binford didn't know what that meant, so he just launched all of his torpedoes. It was too long a range. None of them hit. So that's one of Doorman's biggest weapons, another one of his biggest weapons, gone, the torpedoes. And he probably ordered it because the U.S. destroyers were running low on fuel, so they went back to Surabaya. At this point, the Japanese float planes were starting to run low on gas, and so Admiral Takagi has his ship Nachi stop in the middle of battle with people possibly shooting at them to recover the float plane. This is how arrogant and overconfident and sloppy they had gotten. After this incident, the Japanese would stop doing that. They would just send them off to land bases at that point. But Doorman broke off contact. Let's go to the next slide, please. And he starts creeping around, trying to get around the cruisers to get at the convoy. But the Japanese float planes are watching him. And so they know his every move, and he can't really sneak around. He tries to go around on the coast of Java, along the coast of Java, so he can, in part, hide among the, the mountains in the blackness. Except now you have another one of those operational accidents. The Jupiter hits a mine. It was attributed to a submarine torpedo, but it was a mine. And it was a mine not laid, dropped, dumped by a Dutch mine layer that was terrified of a Japanese scout plane. She just dumped her mines and left. And so it was just floating around there, and it just happened to hit the Jupiter. And she lost power and sank. And this is a bizarre incident that just typifies the bad luck and some of the bad judgment involved here. After the Jupiter was sunk, the Dutch cruisers were basically left without destroyer support. The Encounter was the last remaining destroyer available, and she had stuck with the Exeter for too long, and she had not been able to catch up. And so after the destroyer Jupiter was hit, the cruisers, led by the Ruyter, followed by the Perth, the Houston, and the Java, they turned north. And as this drawing shows, although it has the cruisers in the wrong order, she came across the survivors of the Kortner. They were still floating around there in boats, and Doorman had to have the cruiser turn, and so he wouldn't drown them or run them over. And as the ships went by, they dropped off a flare or a float light of some kind to mark it. And Doorman the communication on the Ruyter had been knocked out. So he had the Perth behind him signal the encounter to stop by and pick up the Kortner's survivors and take them back to Surabaya. Now they have no escorting destroyers. It's just four cruisers in the dark, sailing on, not knowing what they'll find. They're just poking around blindly. That's all they can do. Next slide. And so here's what happens. They sight the Nachi in the Haguro. They get into a slow duel with their guns because the crews are exhausted at this point and they're running out of ammunition. And the Nachi and the Haguro fire their illumination rounds, and they blind the Allied cruisers so they can't see the Japanese ships to shoot at them. And then the Japanese stop firing their guns. Why would they do that? Doorman figured it out, and so he immediately turned to starboard. Torpedoes were coming, but he couldn't really communicate it that fast, so it was slow and passing around. The last cruiser in line, the Java, could not turn fast enough, and she took a torpedo. And shortly after she took the torpedo, it detonated her aft ammunition stack. So it blew off her stern completely. She was just a blazing wreck at that point. Just one torpedo. And the De Ruyter, Doorman saw the Java being hit, and he calculated that the torpedoes had passed by. This was only about a minute. And so he turns to try to reform the column, now with just 3 cruisers. But the torpedoes had not passed. And I love this incident. And it was told to me by one of the histories of the Netherlands East Indies campaign. And apparently there was someone on the De Ruyter's bridge who saw a wake approaching, and he was like, what's that? And Doorman looks at it and says, oh, that's a torpedo. And then the torpedo hits the De Ruyter, and there's a big explosion, and it sets the cruiser on fire and completely disables her. She loses power. It sets off her pyrotechnics locker. So she's shooting up all these flares and stuff. It's a big fireworks show, except there's really not a whole lot of patriotism involved. And because they're in the midst of a turn for this, there's some problems with when the De Ruyter stops in the path of the Perth. And so she has to turn to avoid it. And then the Houston flits off in the other direction. Doorman tells them, go to Tanjung Priok, go to Batavia. Don't rescue us. Too hot. It's too hot right now. Don't rescue us. So the Perth and the Houston form up a 2-ship convoy of their own, and they turn and head towards Tanjung Priok in Batavia, leaving Doorman and the De Ruyter and the Java to sink in the darkness. And I'm not sure how the Perth and the Houston managed to get back to Batavia, because I think Nishimura's destroyer flotilla was in front of them. But anyway, at that point, the Japanese break off. And the Houston and the Perth and the Houston, it's this force under the command of Captain Waller, the Perth at this point. They go back to Tanjung Priok. Battle of the Java Sea is over. Java is lost. Next slide. It's just explaining the difference between a column turn, or what Morrison calls a column movement. Next slide. And a line turn, or what sometimes is called a ship's turn, where they all turn simultaneously. And next one should be the echelon turn, where you turn to put the formation in echelon. And that's probably what happened here because of the lack of communications. I need to say, as a lawyer, do not try this at home. Do not try a column movement at home. It's too dangerous. Next slide, please. Sunda Strait. This is another embarrassment in some respects. Go next slide. Okay, this is Tanjung Priok. And this is where the Houston and the Perth ended up. If you go to the next slide, you'll see more evidence of it, more of the layout of it, including a Bantam Bay on the far western part of Java. If we go back 2 slides a little bit so I can show, we have a problem here because that line of islands, Sumatra, Java, Bali, Lombok, That's called the Malay Barrier. And there are very few ways through that barrier, like the Sunda Strait, the Bali Strait, the Badong Strait, the Lombok Strait. Those are the only ways through. And now we have ships trapped on the north coast of Java, and they need to get to the south coast. And there are really only a few ways to get through, and the Japanese are approaching those areas. So let's keep going forward. Got that. And this is the Sunda Strait. And where we were having this last engagement was over that little peninsula thing on the island on the right. That sticks out. And we see Krakatoa in here, and Topper's Island, Tavares and Diveg, which is like the island in the way because it's all in the way of everybody. This is the general layout of it. Next slide. The Houston and the Perth are in Tanjung Priok. They're trying to get fuel. They can't because they need to save it for all the Dutch ships. That's what they were told, although the Dutch ships were pretty much all sunk, but they couldn't convince. And the Tanjung Priok, the port facilities were being destroyed at that point to keep them from the Japanese. The Houston and Perth decided to leave that night. They're told to go to Chillichat by Helfrich, who was determined to continue fighting. He'd fight to the end of every last British, Australian, American, and Dutch. And the Americans didn't really appreciate it, but he was in command. So Houston and Perth were going to leave that night, along with the Dutch destroyer Evertsen. No one tells the Evertsen she's supposed to leave, so she's not ready to leave. The Houston and Perth go off on their own. Left behind in the offices at Tanjung Priok was a report that the Japanese were less than 24 hours away from the Sunda Strait. Nobody told the Perth and the Houston that. Information, communications. Oh, by the way, just as the Ruyter was hit by the torpedo at the Battle of the Java Sea, I forgot to mention this. As she was set afire, then she got a report of where the convoy was. Maybe that lets you know that all's right with the world, that it just comes on just a little bit too late. But there's nothing anyone could do about it now. No one told the Perth and the Houston the Japanese were approaching the Sunda Strait. They were told that the area around it looked clear. The Houston and Perth go hugging the north coast of Java to try to get through the Sunda Strait. They're picked up by the Fubuki, destroyer Fubuki, and they're followed. And then they run into a Japanese invasion convoy. This is the Eastern convoy landing on the coast of Java at Bantam Bay, near Bantam. All these transports there. They finally caught a convoy of invasion transports at the most vulnerable moment, but they have no ammunition left. And there are so few of them left. But what's really interesting here is the Japanese appear to have been positioned to stop ships from escaping, not to protect the invasion convoy. They were trying to stop ships from escaping. Arrogant, overconfident, sloppy. So the Houston and the Perth get in between the Japanese escorts and the transports they're supposed to be escorting. And to a certain extent, hilarity results. The Japanese cruiser Mogami fires a brace of torpedoes at the Houston and Perth. They turn, the torpedoes miss, and they go to the invasion bay and strike 4 Japanese transports, including the one with the commanding general on board. Arrogant, overconfident, sloppy. But there were just too many Japanese ships. And the Mikuma and the Mogami, the 2 Japanese heavy cruisers involved, they were just too powerful, even though they were so ineptly handled, they nearly ran on aground on the tiny island on the right side of the map here. And they pounded the Perth and the Houston, who tried to force their way through, but ultimately it was torpedoes that doomed both ships. And the Perth went down first. Her engines were still running when she was sunk. She almost drove herself into the deep. The Houston, she was hit by torpedoes, and she slowed down and was still burning. And there were images of her burning and rolling over with all these Japanese searchlights on her. The Japanese would they loved using searchlights. We didn't quite use them a whole lot, but the Japanese would flip searchlights on and off to try to pretend that we couldn't, see where the searchlights were in the darkness, and the Houston sun. So they didn't get through. The Evertsen follows on behind. She sees a battle in the area of St. Nicholas Point, Bantam Bay. And so seeing that battle, knowing the Houston and Perth are fighting for their lives, she goes around it. She goes around all the way to the coast of Sumatra. How brave. What a commitment to duty you have there, Evertsen. So she gets picked up by 2 Japanese destroyers because she's not moving fast enough. She doesn't have one of her boilers going. And the Japanese destroyers start chasing her. The captain of the Evertsen decides his ship is lost, especially once they set a fire aboard her. He runs her aground on Sibuku Bazaar, where an explosion blows her stern off. It's really one of the most inept performances of any ship in the war. Next slide, please. And that's the destroyer Evertsen. That really, we're talking Victoria Cross material here. Next slide, please. And this was the second battle of the Java Sea, the last attempt of any ships to get through. The 4 American destroyers didn't have torpedoes left, but they slipped through the Bali Strait. If you go on further, next slide. The Exeter was with the Encounter and the Pope and the Vitivith at Surabaya. The Vitivith, her captain gave her crew shore leave. The Japanese are 24 hours from landing on your island. They're about to win, and you're giving your crew shore leave. What are they going to do? There was a lot of just refusal to face the facts on the part of the Dutch here. So the Vitivith was stuck in Surabaya, couldn't go anywhere. The Exeter left with the Pope and the Encounter. The Exeter was still able to move. She managed to get up to about 24 knots speed. She was still slowed down, but she was down to 1 steam line. And that would end up being critical here. Also critical was that Admiral Palliser, remember him? Philip's chief of staff? He comes up with this brilliant plan. Instead of having the Exeter, the Pope, and the Encounter go around, they can't go through the Bali Strait because the Exeter is too deep in the water. So they could go through the Badong Strait between Bali and Lombok, which is deep enough, but they have the Denpasar airfield there. Or they could go through the Sunda Strait, which the Japanese would probably block by that point. Well, Palliser is scared of that Denpasar airfield. So what he decides to do is he's going to have the Exeter, the Pope, and the Encounter hang out all day under Japanese-controlled airspace off of Borneo and then try to get through the Sunda Strait that night. Brilliant! What could go wrong? One of the British sailors in an interview that I saw about the battle and the video about it, he flat out called Palliser an idiot. And this is true. You had the better chance of getting out if you just went as fast as possible through the Lombok Strait. The problem was not at this point staying inside, getting air cover or whatever. You needed to get out as fast as possible. And you needed to get in the direction of Australia as fast as possible. You don't want to hang around there. It doesn't matter if the Japanese find you. They were going to find you anyway. You had to get in a position where you had some options. The Exeter, the Pope, and the Encounter had no options at this point, thanks to Palliser. The Exeter is found by the Nachi and the Haguro, who are still hanging around, but it's low on ammunition. So they call in the 2 other sister ships of the Nachi and the Haguro, the Ashigara and the Mayoko. And the Mayako was normally the other ship with the Haguro in the 5th Cruiser Division. And they start chasing the Exeter, the Pope, and the Encounter across the Java Sea. Exeter takes a shell hit through that 1 steam line, and that's it. She can't move anymore. The captain tells the destroyers, "Go, save yourselves." But the Encounter tries to keep helping the Exeter, and she can't go anywhere. And so she's sunk. The Pope makes a run for it, a gallant run for it, but she can't escape Japanese seaplanes, and they keep following her, and they drop a bomb, And remember what happened to the Prince of Wales? The Pope is not even hit. She takes a bomb off of her port quarter, but it jars that propeller out of line, that propeller shaft out of line. And so it opens up the shaft passage. She takes water in there. She starts settling by the stern. So next slide, please. And this becomes a famous picture. This is a doctored photo. This is often identified as the Pope because the Japanese identified this as the HMS Pope being sunk. It actually is not. It's the USS Edsel. When she picked up the Langley survivors, she took some aviators and she was told to take them to Chillicothe. Brilliant. No planes for them to fly. Island's about to fall. But let's take all these well-trained flyers to Chillicothe. She was found by Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force. And their escorts, battleships Hiei and Kirishima, cruisers, heavy cruiser seaplane tender things, Tonde and Shikuma, light cruiser Abakuma, destroyers, and they start shooting her up. They can't hit her. And she's just making a nuisance of herself because she knows she's going to die. So an angry Admiral Nagumo sends up the flyers and they start bombing her. They hit her. She's sunk. And they record the whole thing. Whatever survivors she had a few of them that were picked up, and then they were killed in a war crime near Makassar. Go to the next one. Now, the Japanese identified that ship on the right as the HMS Pope. The actual destroyer Pope, the USS Pope, is on the left. So, and that's from a Japanese magazine. So they sort of looked alike in terms of their sinking. So some of that's understandable, but it was still both ships sunk. And there were a number of other ships sunk because the Kido Butai was south of Java at that point, and they were intercepting anyone trying to escape, not just the Edsel. They tried to get the Whipple, who had picked up the Langley survivors. The Langley survivors were transferred to the tanker Pecos, and then Kido Butai attacked and sank the Pecos. How did it feel to be those Langley survivors at that point? The Whipple came back, and she picked up the survivors, but then she found out a submarine was there, and so she had to leave. The Edsel was going to go pick them up, but she was intercepted by Kido Butai first. Destroyer Pillsbury was sunk. British destroyer Stronghold was sunk. Australian sloop Yara. That's an interesting story. She was escorting a convoy. Japanese cruisers, heavy cruisers, came to them to try to kill them, obviously. The Yara stood up to them. She was the only ship who could stand up to them, and she was completely outgunned, but she stood up anyway. And she was quickly overwhelmed and sunk, but it was a heroic tale. I encourage anyone who can to go and look it up. Next slide.
There we go.
That's pretty much it. And the 4 U.S. destroyers were the only ships from inside the Malaya barrier who were able to escape. So,
wow. I mean, absolutely spellbinding. And all I can think of is make sure I book you again to come back and do a sequel, the part 2, because absolutely, I mean, I've sat and listened to some masterclass presentations over 450 shows over the last year and a half, but this is in the top 5. Absolutely fantastic work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. We've got a series on the Guadalcanal Solomons campaign. It started with Guadalcanal and then it moved up to the Solomons. We're finishing that up right now. It turned into a series of books because I write a lot. I put a lot of words in there and I go into a lot of detail. And some of these battles in the middle and upper Solomons don't get a lot of coverage. And some of them involve the Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand Navy ships. Mm-hmm. So we got that coming out. And so thank you for having me on. I enjoy talking about the Pacific.
I think we noticed. I think we kind of got the idea that you enjoy doing this. But no, I mean, we enjoyed listening. And yeah, come back and talk about Guadalcanal, because we've done land warfare on Guadalcanal. We've done a little bit about the air war, but we haven't really tackled the naval element of it yet. So that would be something you can come back and talk about if you'd like to. But I think we should let you go and have a lie down, because I need to lie down, taking in all that information. I'm definitely going to rewatch this one tomorrow. So Absolutely brilliant stuff. So, folks, I'll just remind folks who are coming up, and I'll come and say goodbye to you in a second. So, nothing for me tomorrow. And then Tuesday are 3 parts about living history. So, World War II reenactment. So, wearing uniforms, commemorative events, doing it professionally. We've got people involved who are working with museums, people who do it for film and theatre. It'll be an amazing 3 shows. Then it all carries on with much more stuff into March. So, thank you very much for your attention today. And, keep liking, keep subscribing, and keep telling people what we're doing here. But right now, I'm just going to say thank you again to Geoffrey Cox. Remind everybody that the link to the book is in the description below, and that's just the book about today's the subject. There are other books in the series, as Jeff said there. So brilliant. We'll leave it at that. So this is Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your weekend. Cheers, everybody. Bye.